This is the Art of Darkness podcast with Kevin Kautzman
and Brad Kelly. We're a couple of very online writers interested in the dark side of what drives creative people to create against all odds.
This show is about art and the people who make it, what it costs them, and what it takes to bring something unique and impactful into the world.
Each episode, we excavate the life and work of an artist you might think you know.
Don't worry, they're all safely dead.
On every episode, we try and find out just what the hell was wrong with them and how they worked through their darkness to create something that lives on after them and continues to move culture.
Find us online at artofdarkpod.com and on Twitter at artofdarkpod.
And we are back. Art of Darkness, the podcast about the dark side of creativity. I am Brad Kelly. This is Kevin Kautzman. Kevin, how are you doing?
I'm very well. How are you, Brad?
Who's that? Who is that?
This is Thoth.
This
is Thoth, the god of letters and magic.
And podcasts, I've heard.
And podcast. Thoth.
Yeah.
Just Thoth it on the pod. We got a core episode today.
We do. Yeah. I'm very excited. We're going to be talking about Sylvia Plath. I guess let's just jump into it. Kevin, what do you know about Sylvia Plath?
Well, you're going hard and fast, Brad. Slow down. Take me out to dinner first.
Sorry, I'm so excited.
No. Okay, what do I know about Sylvia Plath? American poet, mid-century American poet, married to another rather famous poet whose name escapes me off the top of my head. Sort of the spiritual tulpa of moody, angsty teenage girl poets, which I'm sure is somewhat bigoted and wrong-headed, but that would be the stereotype of Sylvia Plath. The Bell Jar, the very famous book, and considered a major American poet, and if I'm not mistaken, a suicide.
Yes. Yeah, that's
okay.
That's all right.
Great.
Yeah.
Okay, how'd I do?
Yeah, that's pretty good, man. I don't have to take issue with any of that. We can just close this down.
Okay, right. That was Art of Darkness, artofdarkpod.com, patreon.com/artofdarkpod.
That's right. Now, of course, there's a lot more to the story, but yeah, that's all correct. One thing just I'm going to front load this. So the After Dark portion, which we do for every episode, 20 to 30 minutes, sometimes even a little bit longer, especially on these core episodes, bonus content for you lovely folks that support us on Patreon and on Substack. It's Art of Dark Pod at both of those. $5 a month, you get that for every episode we do, including our guest dark room episodes, but there's also other bonuses. The book club coming up later this summer. We're going to be reading The Passenger and Stella Maris by Cormac McCarthy. You can go back and listen to previous book club meetings on stuff like Hamlet, poems of Emily Dickinson. What else have we talked about?
Oh, we've done so much good stuff on the book club. We did Flannery O'Connor.
That's right. Yeah.
You can go to artofdarkpod.com. There's a link to the book club there, and this year's schedule is there. We're going to do Le Guin. We're going to be reading what book from Le Guin?
I believe The Left Hand of Darkness.
Left Hand of Darkness, and then at the end of the year, we're reading Dune. Apropos nothing. My podcast. My Dune. Yeah. my podcast, my book
I'm going to be
club,
just bathing in like a thing of black like oil while we record that.
Tremendous. Yeah, just another Saturday for Brad Kelly.
That's right.
That does remind me, we also have a live event coming up in Hamtramck in Detroit, October 26th. Michigan. We are doing The Death of Harry Houdini. It is our second live show. For fans of the show, really consider coming on out. If you're in the region, if you're feeling like seeing Detroit, it's going to be a really fun party. We're going to turn it into it's going to be a live show. It's also going to be a Halloween party. And
Halloween party. Yeah. It's at a little community theater. There's a bar adjacent to it. We'll be hanging out after, and it's going to be a good time for sure. So definitely come out for that. Okay, so getting into it, I'm going to do this episode slightly different. One thing, this is the first episode that I have prepared using an ebook. So it's very
Uh,
interesting. So we'll see how this goes.
the world's going to hell. The
I know.
world started going to hell when we stopped teaching Latin and Greek, and men stopped wearing hats, and
Yeah.
self-service went away at the gas station.
Yeah, you're right.
And
You're
now
definitely right
Brad's
about
got
that.
an ebook.
Yeah, it's ridiculous. But
Uh,
so it's either if this goes off the rails, that'll be a good indicator of whether or not this is a good move or not. From what I can tell, there's advantages and disadvantages. My sources, though I do actually have a physical copy of the main source, but I ended up reading it on my ebook, is this monstrosity doorstop called Red Comet, The Short
whoa.
Life and Blazing Art of Sylvia Plath. Now, the fact that there is an over 1,000 page biography about somebody who died at the age of 30 should tell you something about the level of relevance and intensity and sort of historical vibrancy that we've got going on here. I'm also going to be referencing um, a book called The Last Days of Sylvia Plath by our buddy Carl Rollyson. Carl
Friend of the
Rollyson came,
pod,
yeah, friend of the
Carl
pod.
Rollyson. He's been on the
Yeah,
pod.
yeah, he came on and we talked about Faulkner way back in the day. One of the first dark rooms that wasn't just like somebody we already knew from the
Mm,
internet.
hmm
So
hmm
and this is good, but as it indicates, it really focuses on sort of the last bit of Sylvia's life. So I probably won't mention anything about it till kind of later. Um, the and then of course we'll be reading some of the poems, and Kevin, I might throw a link at you here and there to have you read a poem.
And
Um,
as everybody knows, I love to read a poem.
yeah,
I accidentally read a poem on our recent appearance on the Granite Mountain Movie Club where
that's
we
right.
talked about Fargo.
Hmm.
Oh, yeah, you betcha.
That was
There
great.
was, it's a podcast about Fargo, so it's pretty good. It's pretty good. Really go and listen to that. That was a lot of fun. If you want to hear Brad and I
Yeah.
talk about the great film Fargo, but I
Hmm.
accidentally read the poem Fargo
Hmm.
by John Updike. It
Hmm.
seemed like a natural fit. Anyway, of course,
Yeah.
I'm happy to read
Yeah.
Brad.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
I might throw you some links. So I'm going to start with a kind of an overview of her life, fairly brief, and then what I'm gonna do is we're gonna we're gonna brush in additional strokes based on themes that I see running through her life and work. So this is gonna be a little bit more of a poem than it is going to be a novel, if you catch my drift. So, um, to start off here, so Sylvia Plath, born October 27th, 1932, in Boston, Massachusetts. She dies February 11th, 1963, at the age of 30 years old in London. She grew up the child of a German father, a guy named Otto Plath, who was from Posen, which is a province in Prussia. He also had family from Grabau. Her Sylvia Plath's mother was a second generation immigrant of Austrian descent. Her father was a noteworthy entomologist, educated at Harvard and elsewhere, and wrote a very well regarded book on bumblebees, and also taught for years, several years at
Oh,
Boston University.
how charming.
Yeah,
What a
yeah.
wonderful thing what a
Hey, I
wonderful thing
mean,
to, yeah.
right,
That's
right.
great. Yeah.
Yeah.
You can do
Um,
worse.
yeah. Her mother, Plath's mother was a literary woman who suspended her career ambitions to a domestic life, and taught writing for a time, and also taught not writing like in a creative writing course, but like shorthand, secretarial stuff, typing, that kind of thing. Um, Plath's father died when she was 8 years old. She spent all of her childhood in Massachusetts, graduating from Wellesley High School and afterward attending Smith College, which is the girls' school that's near Amherst, basically. She went there on a pretty significant scholarship. At that time she had already been.
Is that one of the seven sisters they talk
I
about?
think it is one of the seven sisters. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
There's
yeah, yeah.
Hollyoak.
Okay.
I don't know all of them, but yeah, I think that is one of the seven sisters.
Sure, sure. Okay. All
Yeah.
right. Well, that's a whole thing. Yeah,
Mhm.
it's a group of colleges in the northeastern United States. Yeah. Let's Barnard, Bryn
Barnard.
Mawr, Mount Holyoke, Smith, Wellesley, Vassar,
That's right.
Radcliffe. Okay. All
Radcliffe.
right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, and when she went to Smith College, she had already actually been published, local newspapers. She'd been published in 17 magazines. She'd been published in the Christian Science Monitor. Nothing groundbreaking, but already multiple publications before she ends up in college is indicative of the kind of person that we're dealing with here. Uh, she was universally described as an excellent, hardworking, and ambitious student. And she apparently had a documented IQ of 160. And 160 is like that's like an actual textbook genius.
Sure,
Right,
that's like so many of our mutuals on the Bird
right,
website.
right, right,
Everybody's
right,
like only
right.
160.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, no wonder she went to Smith. My
Right.
God.
Right, right.
Really,
Um,
160. That is, yeah, that is quite intense
it
and
is. Yeah.
abnormal.
Yeah, like the average person, maybe not maybe a person who's like working in theoretical physics knows a bunch of people that have 160, but the average person out there, you might have met one person that has a 160 in your life. They're not,
Maybe.
they're unicorns,
Sure.
man. It's like
And you might,
it's like a 7 foot tall person. That's kind of what it
right,
is. Yeah,
right. It's like a successful podcaster.
that's right.
You
That's
might
right.
have met one once in your life, but he immediately submerged himself
Yeah,
back into his float
yeah,
tank.
yeah, yeah. He immediately started like trying to get you to subscribe to like Harry's Razors or something. Uh,
Are you having any erectile dysfunction? Because I got something for you. I'm a successful podcaster. I got razors. I got ED meds. I got whatever you need. I
that's
got
right.
whatever you
That's
need.
right.
It's so
Uh,
funny. Success in this field it amounts to like becoming a barker for
right. Oh, they've
like
got. Oh,
crummy,
they're doing ads now. Oh,
yeah,
that's big.
like
That's real
subscription
good.
services.
Yeah.
Like we got fresh avocados delivered to your door twice
Yeah.
weekly. Fresh,
Yeah.
fresh avocados. It's avocad.com slash
It is a subscription service, and every week you get
right.
four
We get fresh
avocados.
avocados.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I you can tell that I do not have a 160 IQ. If
Yeah,
people, yeah, I
no,
don't. Yeah.
that's fine. That's fine. From being familiar with, not personally, but being familiar with a few people who are in that
Hmm.
range, just
Yeah.
historically, it might be better not to.
Mm.
A lot of times it
Hmm.
doesn't go that well when
Right.
you're
And it
rolling like
certainly
that.
and it certainly doesn't lead to necessarily lead to happiness
No, no,
at
no,
all.
no,
Yeah.
definitely not. Yeah.
Yeah.
While she was at Smith, she was given a guest editor position at Mademoiselle during her third year of college, and this was like a highly prized position to get. Every year they took 12 or 20 women for this magazine, and Mademoiselle was a big deal in the 1950s. This exposed Sylvia Plath to New York City and provides the real life material for sort of the first act of her 1963 novel, The Bell Jar, which was published under a pen name just weeks before her death, and since has sold at least 2 million copies. During college, she experienced intense depression, overwork. She was the kind of person who just worked until she passed out. That was sort of her mold, her how she rolled. Also sort of feeling marginalized, also being friggin' brilliant. This is again is can be a challenge. Um, and we're gonna talk again. I'm doing a real high level gloss over, and then we're gonna drill into some things. Um, she, while she was attending Smith College, she had this depressive episode, and she was given electroconvulsive therapy. Um, and after which she made the first of several suicide attempts, which led to 6 months in McLean Hospital and more ECT and insulin shock therapy. Yeah.
Ooh,
So,
okay. So Hemingway had the ECT.
mhm.
Of all the subjects we've covered, is she the second one? There may have been another.
David Foster Wallace had ECT.
Did he?
Yeah.
Okay,
But
right.
David Foster
It's
Wallace
still done to
had
this day.
It is. David Foster Wallace had like more somewhat, and it had mixed effects, but David Foster Wallace's was more of like the modern version of ECT.
Sure.
We're going to talk about what Sylvia's was like. Um, it's arguable that one of the most significant sort of mental health issues that Sylvia had was actually PTSD from her electroconvulsive shock therapy may have been the biggest thing in a soup of issues.
She had a
Yeah.
bad case of the toe ghosts.
Yeah, it's right. That's right. Yeah. What if we just electrocute them?
What if we just electrocute the toe ghost?
Right.
What sound will it make?
Right. We'll find out. Yeah.
We're gonna find out. We're gonna find out, Sylvia. You just relax. Bite down on this. I mean, how horrible.
That's
How
terrible.
horrible. I
Yeah,
mean,
we're
it was it
laughing
was it
because
yeah, we laugh so we don't cry.
yeah.
Was it against her will? I guess we'll find out.
Yeah, we'll find out. Let me get to that
Yeah.
part.
Yeah.
So 1956, she's what, 24 years old. She gets a Fulbright scholarship, and goes to Cambridge. She
Oh,
meets.
that's a good school.
It is a good school. She meets the poet Ted Hughes, Kevin, who you referred to, and they get married. I think 3 or 4 months later. They move to the United States, mutually amplifying each other's career. They're both about roughly the same age. I think he might be 2 years older than her. And they have a sort of very powerful kind of like Mr. Fu kind of love affair. Like they wrote poetry together. They went to Yaddo. They made friends with the various big American poets at the time, and eventually they land back in England, where Plath has her daughter Frida, and published her first collection of poetry, The Colossus, in 1960. 1961, Plath had a miscarriage. She claimed later that Ted Hughes beat her 2 days before the miscarriage. Through the early 1960s, the marriage fell apart, and Hughes's behavior has been criticized ever since, even after his own death. And we're going to talk about that in more detail. Through the early 1960s, Plath wrote The Bell Jar and the poems that would become the posthumous collection called Ariel, which is probably, if you wanted a single, it's probably her best work. She had a second child named Nicholas. She split from Ted and took the children to live in the former London home of W.B. Yeats during the coldest winter in 100 years. And then on February 10th of 1963, Sylvia Plath sealed off the kitchen from the rest of the house and put her head in the oven until she died.
With gas. You mean with gas? Okay.
Yeah.
Whoa, doggy.
Yeah. So,
whoa, mama.
That's intense.
Whoa.
Intense.
In Yates's house.
In Yates's house. Yeah. Yeah.
I did not
it's a
know
house
this.
that had a plaque that said, WB
Sure,
Yeats.
it'll have
here.
the blue. Yeah, it'll have the blue. Probably still does. And then now it probably says Sylvia Plath lived here.
Yeah.
And died here. Well,
yeah.
Goodness gracious. These poets. What's going on?
Yeah. Well, let's see if we can get to the bottom of it. I'm going to read a bit from this Red Comet by Heather. I can't even pick it up. Red Comet by Heather Clark. It's really well done. The only drawback, and this isn't actually a criticism of it as a piece of work, but a sort of guide for future reading. It's probably too detailed for the casual reader. Somebody who's like, well, I want to know more about the life of. So there's a lot in here you don't need, frankly, to really get to the bottom.
Probably doesn't read, if it's 1,000 pages about somebody who lived to 30, it probably doesn't read like a novel.
It doesn't.
It's just boom, scholarship. Day by day by day by day. They were doing this and they were doing that. And great. We need that.
It needs to exist. It's
incredible.
A super important book. It's just as a recommended reading, there are other biographies out there that might be a little more palatable than this doorstopper. Yeah, exactly.
Sure.
But let me read from it. Quote.
Man, we need oven control. I'm telling you what.
Yeah. Well, and there's another story about an oven in the After Dark, and it's a weird. What we're talking about in the After Dark, it's like a ghost story, okay, about some things that happen after Plath's death. It's really good. You're going to want to hear this.
And that's for the subscribers. All right.
That's right. Okay, quote. Recent scholarship has deepened our understanding of Plath as a master of performance and irony, yet the critical work done on Plath has not sufficiently altered her popular, cliched image as the Marilyn Monroe of the literati. Melodramatic portraits of Plath as a crazed, poetic priestess are still with us. A recent biographer called her, quote, a sorceress who had the power to attract men with a flash of her intense eyes, a tortured soul whose only destiny was death by her own hand. He wrote that she, quote, aspired to transform herself into a psychotic deity. These caricatures have calcified over time into the popular reductive version of Sylvia Plath we all know, the suicidal writer of the Bell Jar, whose cultish devotees are black-clad young women. Plath thought herself Plath thought herself a different kind of sorceress. Quote, I am a damn good high priestess of the intellect, she wrote her friend Mel Woody in July 1954. Many of Plath's friends have grown impatient with these distorted versions of her. Plath's close friend Phil McCurdy does not recognize the literary psycho he encounters in biographies that fail to capture her ebullient, brainy essence. Quote, we were crazy, but it was crazy about Kafka, he said. Plath's Smith confidant, Ellie Friedman Klein, is tired of her brilliant friend being changed to, quote, the death machine, with her suicide sensationalized. That Plath is now identified with the cliches she examined ironically in her work as part of her tragedy. Elizabeth Hardwick once wrote of Sylvia Plath, quote, when the curtain goes down, it is their own dead body there on the stage, sacrificed to her own plot. Now, this is part of what I want to do in this episode is, of course, we're going to talk about the suicide in those final days, but we want to, as we do many times on this episode, we want to break down this cliche a bit and really try to get to the person underneath it and their work. I had not really read much, if any, Sylvia Plath poetry before diving into this episode. And especially as you get to the later poetry, I kind of bowled over by it. Some of it is just it's it's intense and it's beautiful and strange, and it's not when you think of that cliche of the what was it the black her black clad devotees, you think it's just going to be this like dark morose thing, and it certainly is often dark, but what you don't expect is the like mythopoetic, almost psychedelic quality of some of it. Yeah, so what I'm going to read.
Buckle up, people. We're going to be reading some poems,
Some
some
poems.
poems on Art of
Get
Darkness.
ready.
Hmm.
So the first one I'm going to read is called Faun, Faun, and it was she wrote it in 1956. Quote, haunched like a fawn, he hooed from grove of moonglint and fen frost until all owls in the twigged forest flapped black to look and brood on the call this man made. No sound but a drunken coot lurching home along riverbank. Stars hung water sunk, so a rank of double star eyes lit bows where those owls sat. An arena of yellow eyes, watching the changing shape he cut, saw hoof hardened from foot, saw sprout goat horns, marked how God rose and galloped woodward in that guise. Okay, let's read another one. This one is called The Hardcastle Craigs, and I think this was written a year later, 1957. This is a little bit longer. I might not read the whole thing, but it'll give you a sense of what it sounds like. Hardcastle Craigs. Quote, flint-like her feet struck such a racket of echoes from the steely street, tacking in moon-blued crooks from the black stone-built town that she heard the quick air ignite its tinder and shake. A firework of echoes from wall to wall of the dark dwarfed cottages. But the echoes died at her back as the walls gave way to fields and the incessant seethe of grasses riding in the full of the moon, manes to the wind. Tireless tide as a moonbound sea moves on its route. There, though a mist wraith wound up from the fissured valley and hung shoulder high ahead, it fattened to no family-featured ghost, nor did any word body with a name the blank mood she walked in. Once past the dream-peopled village, her eyes entertained no dream, and the Sandman's dust lost luster under her foot-soles. The long wind, paring her person down to a pinch of flame, blew its burdened whistle in the whirl of her ear, and like a scooped-out pumpkin crown, her head cupped the babble. All the night gave her, in return for the paltry gift of her bulk and the beat of her heart, was the humped indifferent iron of its hills and its pastures bordered by black stones set on black stone. That one keeps going for a while, but I'll cut it there. So those are just some examples, and those don't have any particular reason for to read them now, except I like them. Um, but so now we got kind of the picture of who Sylvia was. We're gonna kind of zoom in and into some areas, and hopefully I can kind of weave this all together. Um, One of the themes that is sort of omnipresent in her work is nature, and even more specifically, the sea. Um, and I'm saying this early on because I want us to be thinking about her nature, her relationship to nature. I want us to note where it comes up in her biography, and I want us to think about, particularly in the sort of final act of her life, what her relationship to nature sort of meant. Um, she, and again, more specifically than just nature, she also had a sort of a poetic relationship to the sea. I don't know, Kevin, if this concept of having like a sort of a signature landscape means something to you, that everybody has like a particular kind of landscape that feels like theirs.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
yeah, I don't know. I don't know which one you are. Some people are desert people. Some people are woods
Right,
people. Some people are
right,
mountain
right.
people, right? She
Yeah,
was a sea
yeah,
person.
yeah. I think you can be a
Yeah.
city person. I
Yeah, I
think
think
you can
that's
be,
true.
I also think these days too, you can be an internet person,
Oh, no.
which unfortunately
That might
that
not be
might,
good.
yeah, well, in any case, yeah, it's probably not good for you. Yeah.
Right.
No, but I mean, I'm from the
Yeah.
Midwest.
Yeah.
I see pictures of, like the Dakotas and there's a little bow goes off in my heart and I go, okay,
Hmm.
maybe that's where I belong.
Yeah, right, right, right. Now so there's this thing about the sea comes up a number of times, and I just kind of want to point this out. So when she was young, one of her first like good poems, like one of the first, we're not going to read it, but one of the first poems that maybe escapes this like juvenilia thing is a poem that shares its title with the address of her grandparents' house in Massachusetts, and it was right by the ocean. And there's this whole bit about one of her first memories is crawling out towards the sea, like literally as a toddler crawling out towards the sea, and with her mother, and her mother them having sort of a moment with the moon at the seaside, right? She would say that Sylvie would say that she wanted her wedding to take place on a cliff overlooking the sea as a quote, sort of a pledge of honesty, relating one to the huge natural forces of procreation and life, a kind of pagan ritual in some respects, but clean and unadorned. She would also, in what some biographers have come to think of as her first suicide attempt in 1951, while she was out with friends at a beach, Nahant Beach, somewhere in Massachusetts, she would swim out like as far as she could, right? And there's a point where if you swim out far enough, you don't have the strength to swim back, right? It's a very dramatic kind of means of taking yourself out.
And
Um,
swimming in the ocean is a different animal. It's
it's
not like
always a
swimming.
little,
Everybody knows this, but really,
yeah.
if you, yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
Mhm.
things can go sideways pretty quickly. Like you can be like, oh, this is an undertow, or a riptide or whatever. Like, okay, I might die. It can happen very fast. Um, Now this is where she learned something about herself. And there's a quote about this. This is this sort of suicide attempt that maybe wasn't, or maybe was playing at the edges of what it would just of killing herself might be. She said, quote, "The body is amazingly stubborn when it comes to sacrificing itself to the annihilating directions of the mind." Okay. I am going to read two other poems. Let's see. Let's read this. I'm going to read this one. Um, yeah, I'm going to read this one, and then Kevin, I'm going to send you one. So, I am sending one to you in the chat, but let me read one first. If I can find where the chat thing, there it is. All right.
Gotta get comfortable with the landscape of the internet, Brad. This is
Yeah,
where
I
we live
know.
now. This is where we live now, buddy.
Is it really?
There's no ocean anymore.
Yeah.
This is the ocean.
Yeah. So
I
yeah.
am the riptide.
So I'm going to read a poem. I think this is from 1953. So this is before she had a lot of major publications. It might have been, I think it was the first one she published in a journal or something that wasn't like the college journal. But it's called Go Get the Goodly Squab. Quote. And people don't know, squab is like, I think squab is like a pigeon, basically, but
That's
you
like a
eat them.
little bird. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like if you
Yeah.
eat a
Yeah.
pigeon, I think you call it squab, I
Hmm.
believe.
You
Anyway,
know, my first girlfriend in New York, she called pigeons street penguins. Never forgot that.
that's pretty
That was
funny.
very, very funny. It was just because it makes it fun. You're walking around, oh, there's a
Right.
street penguin.
That's right. That's pretty good. So here's Go Get the Goodly Squab. Quote, Go get the goodly squab and gold-lobed corn and pluck the droll-flecked quail where thick they lie. Reap the round blue pigeon from roof ridge, but let the fast-feathered eagle fly. Let the fast-feathered eagle fly and the skies crack through with thunder. Hide, hide in the deep nest, lest the lightning strike you to cinder. Go snare the sleeping bear in leaf-lined den and trap the muskrat napping in slack sun. Dupe the dull sow lounging snout in mud, but let the galloping antelope run. Let the galloping antelope run and the snow blow up behind. Hide, hide in the safe cave, lest the blizzard drive you blind. Go cull the purple snails from slothful shells and bait the drowsing trout by the brook's brim. Gather idle oysters from green shoals, but let the quicksilver mackerel swim. Let the quicksilver mackerel swim where the black wave topples down. Hide, hide in the warm port, lest the water drag you to drown. Okay, so I'm just reading poem. This is a nature poem. It's a Sylvia Plath version of a nature poem. And Kevin, I sent you another one. This is a later poem, I think 1959. This is sort of an ocean poem. She thought about naming her first collection after this poem called Full Fathom 5.
Full fathom five. Old man, you surface seldom. Then you come in with the tides coming. When seas wash cold, foam capped, white hair, white beard far flung. A dragnet rising, falling as waves crest and trough, miles long, extend the radial sheaves of your spread hair, in which wrinkling skeins knotted cot survives. The old myth of origins unimaginable, you float near as keeled ice mountains of the north to be steered clear of not fathomed. All obscurity starts with a danger. Your dangers are many. I cannot look much, but your form suffers some strange injury and seems to die. So vapors ravel to clearness on the dawn sea. The muddy rumors of your burial move me to half believe your reappearance proves rumors shallow, for the archaic trenched lines of your grained face shed time in runnels. Ages beat like rains on the unbeaten channels of the ocean. Such sage humor and durance are whirlpools to make away with the groundwork of the earth and the sky's ridgepole. Waist down, you may wind one labyrinthine tangle to root deep among knuckles, shin bones, skulls, inscrutable, below shoulders not once seen by any man who kept his head. You defy questions. You defy godhood. I walk dry on your kingdom's border, exiled to no good. Your shelled bed, I remember. Father, this thick air is murderous. I would breathe water.
Hmm. So, yeah.
Desire to drown.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Hmm.
Um, yeah, so okay. So now
Heavy.
it
Gnarly.
is. They're
But
they're
what are
gnarly,
we
but
meditating on there? What are we really talking? I don't think we're talking about the ocean. I think we're talking about the ocean, but we're not talking about the ocean. We're talking
well,
about the
that's
yeah, the other yeah. Yeah, right.
she's always, I think, talking on like three levels at least,
Mm-hmm.
in her poetry
Mm-hmm.
particularly.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
It's also
so
simply beautiful. It's simply beautiful.
mhm.
And that there's something to be said for that.
Yeah, no, there's specific lines in there where it's just like, ooh, yeah, nice. They just aesthetically, they're compelling and feel right. Um, she, in fact, talking about this nature thing, she in fact published her first poem when she was just 8 years old. It appeared in the children's section of the Boston Herald. Um, and this was 9 months after her father's passing. And this is the poem. It's very short. Quote, hear the crickets chirping in the dewy grass. Bright little fireflies twinkle as they pass. And it's just sweet. It's a sweet little poem of an 8-year-old. It happens to be in basically perfect trochaic trimeter, but who's paying attention to that?
Right. Yeah. Right. Sure.
Yeah. And I kind of put that poem there because I want to think about, or I want the audience to think about the mentality of an 8-year-old who, on their own volition, writes a poem and submits it to the newspaper. She's not the only kid who ever did that, but it's indicative of the kind of person that you're dealing with. Not only is she interested in writing at 8 years old, she's also interested in it being published, right? It's not just about like, oh, mom, I wrote this thing. It's like, we should get this out there. Maybe this will help my career, right?
Maybe this will bring dad back to life.
That too, right? That
like,
too.
Maybe make dad proud wherever he is.
Yeah.
We got a early parental death. That's on the bingo card. That's always on the Art of Darkness bingo card for sure.
Yeah.
Precocious.
So she's incredibly precocious. And this is like the next theme we kind of talked about. We sort of introduced this nature thing. This next theme I want to talk about in her life and in her work is just ambition. And I want to look at a poem she wrote at age 14. Okay, this is called Fireside Reveries, and Heather Clark in this biography refers to it as Plath's sort of literary manifesto. And this is just the last part of this poem she wrote when she was 14. Quote, I'm dreaming dreams by the fireside, a book of poems in my lap, while through the living screen of fire I see gold castles in the air. My thoughts to shining fame aspire, but there is much to do and dare. Just as I reach the summit's height and gaze down far below, the vision fades into the night, but still the embers flow. I don't want to convince you. I'm not trying to convince you that that's a brilliant poem necessarily, but what it's sort of suggesting is at age 14, she's already thinking about greatness as a writer, what that would be like. She's already kind of trying to point herself in that direction. She, at age 11, she starts to write a little booklet sort of novel thing. Eventually, it's like 26 pages called Stardust. This is about a girl named Nancy who is chosen as a messiah figure by the fairies. It's sort of fairyland autofiction, kind of. And around the time that she writes this, she's getting, fairly serious as a student. This is like when she's 11 is when she gets her IQ test, right? Some kid from a student from the Boston University School of Education came in and they gave all the kids IQ tests. I think they used to do that occasionally. I don't know if that's even still a thing. I don't know.
They used to the incoming class at Yale used to get their skulls measured too. They used to be stripped down. That's very famous and photographed and everything.
They would get photographed naked, at some schools.
I believe so.
Yeah. And they would just be like, "Well, we have to for the records.
We gotta know who we're bringing in here."
Right.
Like your prize horses.
Right.
That's a real story. You can look that up. We're not making that up.
No, that's for real.
Unusual. Odd.
Yeah. And one thing Heather Clark makes note of this about the IQ test, and more so than just what the number was. Sylvia liked taking the test. She enjoyed the process of it, and she was probably told her score. So it's a little, you're 11 years old, and you're like, oh, by the way, you're smarter than anybody we know. That's a lot to put on a kid in a way, right?
Sure.
Yeah.
Your dad's dead. You're a generational genius. You've already been published.
Yeah.
You're in Boston.
Yeah. No pressure.
No pressure.
Yeah.
Gifted kid problems, I think, is what she'd have a whole community on Reddit, on Twitter now. On Reddit. Yeah. Burnt out gifted kids. What a forum to hang out on. Oof.
Well, I was lucky now. I was lucky I was not gifted in particular.
Sure. And certainly not burnt out. That's never happened.
No.
Hello, fellow burnt out gifted kids. It's
right?
me.
With a skateboard.
It's me,
Yeah.
Brad. Oh boy.
Around 12 or 13 years old, she starts a diary, and this rapidly develops into a more of like a working writer's notebook. And she would throughout her life would write in her diary, and she'd have calendars. And this is part of the reason why they can write such a detailed biography. So like she kept a pretty good record of a lot of her life. She in this even 12 or 13 years old, though, she's recording, quote, wild technicolor dreams, and she develops a coded language within her diary so that her mom can't read it, that she calls this language Abish, which I just find very charming. Um, and you know, in these journals, in this diary, there's this indication that like she's writing on almost pure compulsion. Like she kind of can't help herself. She has to sort of do this. She says at age 14, quote, I feel so much like writing tonight that I have to stopper my feelings up tight so that they won't leak out because I haven't enough time to use them. She's also writing stories and poems in here, and even as early as age 14, she's infusing them with quote passionate, lustful romance. Of course, all cloaked in her Abish language so that her mother can't read it. Um, she had friends in school. She was generally well liked throughout her public school years, though, maybe liked even more than she kind of realized. She would regularly kind of refer to being sort of alienated from everybody around her, but oftentimes people would be like, we really liked Sylvia. We didn't think there was an issue. Everybody thought she was great. So, um, she put a lot of pressure on herself to succeed and do really well, and she did do really well. But she also, as you might imagine, somebody of her gifts, there a certain point came in her public school career where she was unstimulated and felt like she was in prison, um, which I think a lot of people do. Um, she would stay up late reading books, which is probably not a surprise. But in addition to writing and reading, and she also painted. And she apparently had real talent. I had a hard time finding any paintings of hers that I was sure that could be actually attributed to her, but I'm sure they're out there. At 14, she earned a place at the Massachusetts Regional Art Exhibit in Boston, and she ranked number 8 in the nation at the National High School Art Exhibition. She found out that she was number 8 in the country, basically at the exact same time as she won honorable mention in a national poetry contest. So she's like a heavy already. She's like 14 years old, and it's already like kind of, she's a prodigy. Um, Throughout her adolescence, we also see this concentrated effort to win awards and be recognized. It was very important to her to win the awards, to be number one, to be top of the class, right? And she mostly does. She wins the Wellesley Award, which is given to one student in her school district, in her school every year, and she's given it's just sort of symbolically significant. She's given the go-to text of new critical thought, a book called Understanding Poetry by Cleanth Brooks and Robert Penn Warren. I think we may have mentioned this book in the Flannery O'Connor episode. So kind of what I'm trying to paint a picture of was in adolescence, we already have this image of this girl who's very talented, but she's also a striver. She's trying to make the most of those gifts for sure. But we also are starting to see her as she gets closer to her time going to college. We're starting to see her as like she's refining as an artist, and she's starting to have like real integrity about what she should be, what are the kinds of things she should be making, where should she be, how should she be leveraging these gifts. And this is where we start to see like some of the major contradictions that would cause so many problems for her. Excuse me. Sylvia Plath is like a proto-feminist. She's like a thoroughly modern woman, but just slightly before that was sort of a widespread thing, right? So she she wanted to be a genuine sort of freewheeling artist, but she also felt and in some ways accepted the pressures of convention. Um, she wanted to have it all. She wanted to have a family with children, and she also wanted to be like a significant artist in her generation. And frankly, at that time, uh, women didn't do that. That's just not how it worked. And so that fear, that sort of genuinely wanting the family and the children, but also like, hey, would it be okay if I also was a writer? Like, can I not, can I not have both of those things? And sort of, um, balking and feeling very frustrated that that wasn't a thing that was sort of, she felt was like allowed
Sure.
for her.
Sure.
Right.
Yeah, we all
Yeah.
feel the cage, but
Mhm.
her time, her intelligence, her ability, that cage had to feel very,
Mhm.
very tight.
Yeah, yeah. And you see her, we'll talk about this when we get to it, but it's actually a huge factor. And I think it actually contributed to this depression era, this first major bout of depression that led to her um, getting ECT and ending up in McLean. Um, a little bit more on just sort of her ambition. The poem I started this thing off, that not the whole episode, but this part about ambition, the fireside reveries thing. That same day she wrote that in her journal, she also wrote this in her journal. She's 14 years old. Quote, "Don't you know I'm going to be the greatest, most entertaining author and artist in the world?" So this is somebody who's got their eye on the prize, right? And also has like may have the talent to do it, right? Um, her mother, her mother is an interesting figure. And we'll talk more about Sylvia's relationship with her, but suffice to say, in this notion of sort of ambition, her mother, Aurelia, um, I think supported it and kind of perhaps even pushed it. Some might argue that she pushed it too hard, but here's an example. When Plath was 17, Aurelia gave her Nietzsche, which so Plath had a Nietzsche phase, which a lot of precocious 17-year-old boys have. Sylvia had this at 17. And, it's kind of, quote, problematic because at the time, the 1950s, Nietzsche was associated with Nazism and atheism, and it was not an appropriate moral guide for a 17-year-old girl, right? And let me just read a little bit from the biography. Quote,
We're gonna make the Uberfrau here. We're
right,
gonna,
right,
right? Yeah,
exactly.
she's gonna self-overcoming, will to
All right.
power.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Just read this little bit here. Quote, yet Nietzsche's ideas regarding autonomy and his dramatic, headstrong prose inspired Plath. Her copy of Thus Spake Zarathustra is heavily annotated. She called it, quote, our Bible of individualism at present in a
Holy
1954
moly.
college paper. Yeah.
Oh gosh.
Her Yale boyfriend Mel Woody, who eventually became a philosophy professor, remembered discussing Nietzsche with her while she was at Smith. Quote, she responded to it. She loved Nietzsche's aphorisms. In 1955, Plath called Nietzsche her, quote, favorite philosopher. The wit and poetry and shock of his epigrams make my soul sneeze itself awake. So yeah. Now, after high school, Sylvia goes in 1950. She gets a full tuition to Smith. She gets another $450 from the Smith Club of Wellesley. As you can imagine, her father died when she was 8. The financial situation in the family was okay, but not enough to just pay for your kid to go to Smith, right? And she had a younger brother too. So this scholarship money was amazing. Her mother had basically said, "Listen, Sylvia, I can give you $400 a year, and whatever you can do to come up with the rest, like you can do whatever you want to do as long as I don't have to give you more than $400. That's all we can afford." And just sort of coincidentally, almost like this kismet, she, with the full scholarship and then the $450 towards room and board, this left exactly $400 left that Sylvia had annually to pay for her education. So she got it all sorted out financially. Um, let's talk about Smith College a little bit. Now, I say that to say this. A lot of the girls that she went to Smith College with were from the upper middle class, the upper class. Sylvia was not. Sylvia was from maybe like the lower middle class. They weren't living hand to mouth, but going to Smith, you had to figure out a way to get there. We weren't just writing a check for you. And a lot of the girls she went with were,
Sure.
They were they
And
were a lot of them, frankly, were going to get a little bit educated so that they could marry a boy from
marry a
Amherst down the
guy. Yeah,
street.
right. Exactly. Yeah,
Yeah,
right. Yeah,
yeah,
finishing school and
right.
sure,
Yeah,
sure,
that's what a
sure.
lot of it was.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
Yeah, so talk a little bit about Smith College, just in general. Smith is in Northampton, Massachusetts, about 2 hours west of Boston. It's right near Amherst. At Smith, Sylvia would excel again. She developed a relationship with the famed American scholar Mary Ellen Chase, who was teaching at Smith at the time. And she got sort of initiated into what's called the New Criticism School of Literary Theory. And I want to talk a little bit about this because Sylvia Plath would sort of pass through several mid-century literary schools of thought and or styles. And I think this is a good way for the audience maybe to learn just a little bit about what those schools were, and maybe us too, Kevin. So new criticism basically, new criticism is a school of thought that came to dominate in the middle of the 20th century. It's largely formalized following the publication of the poet John Crow Ransom's book, The New Criticism. Um, it, it's kind of hard to totally encapsulate it, any sort of literary theory or thought as time goes on. If it's popular, it kind of outgrows itself in a certain way. But um, the gist is that for the thinking was by John Crow Ransom and others that for generations, literary theory had been focused on things like the history and meaning of individual words, relationships to foreign languages, the biographies of the authors, the ethical and philosophical issues, political stuff, uh, just generally a sort of competition for who's more erudite is often what a lot of literary theory boils down to. The new critics, they said, hey, you basically forgot that there is actually a work of art here, right? That you have an aesthetic, meaningful thing that the school forgot about. How about we take another close look at that? And so looking more closely at the work, sort of almost in isolation, led to a clear focus on artistic components such as structure, literary devices, et cetera, et cetera. And I think there's a way of understanding the MFA movement, um, the Masters of Fine Arts movement, as kind of coming out of new criticism. Because if you think back the way that they were teaching literature before new criticism, there wasn't a whole lot in there that was useful for learning how to write a novel, right? There was plenty of useful to like figuring out the whole context of the novel, but if your goal is to write a novel, the utility was mixed at best. But if we're going to focus on it as a work of art and how it operates,
Sure.
this could actually be helpful. Yeah.
Yeah, you're gonna write a novel. There's the liquor store.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Here's a pack of cigarettes, and slap in
Yeah.
the face, and then
Right.
go hide in your hovel and come
Right.
out with a novel.
Right. Right. Right.
Yeah,
Right.
thank God we have the MFAs now, which are so different from this.
Yeah.
No,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
that's a great point. No, it's very interesting, Brad. I had not
Yeah.
thought about that.
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
I
Hmm.
think there's some real truth to that. And the Iowa School for Writers is starting up around the same time New
Sure,
Criticism
right.
was. So
We're kicking off. We're really going to try to train writers, and
yeah,
I know you say the three letters MFA in order, in the mirror, and it
yeah,
summons an adjunct, and everyone gets really
yeah,
upset. And
yeah.
but
There's legitimate criticism of the MFA program. There's program kind of stuff. There's also, frankly, resentment for not being able to get into one.
sure, sure,
Uh,
yeah, I've seen
there's
that.
all
I've heard
kinds of
that. I've heard that. Yeah,
there's all
yeah.
kinds of
No,
stuff.
but it's very interesting. It's interesting to think because it hasn't always existed, right? And so,
No,
what did they do before? I mean, I suppose you would have just studied English. You would have just learned Greek, Latin, and then you go, okay, I'm going to try to, read a bunch of novels, and I'm going to write a novel.
right, right.
Yeah.
And you'd
So
hope you
okay.
picked it up by kind of by osmosis, right?
Sure,
Yeah,
sure.
yeah. So like any kind of school of thought, academically or intellectually, eventually new criticism got kind of rigid. and technical, and eventually it's kind of and these things kind of led to it falling away. So like in the 50s you get new criticism, and then not too long later it sort of falls apart a little bit, and a bunch of other schools pop up, and this is where you get sort of feminist literary criticisms kicks off, structuralism, post-structuralism, new historicism, and all of this just sort of efflorescence of different schools of thought through the late 20th century. And yet, new criticism actually probably left us with the most enduring tools of literary theory, I would say, out of not all, I'm not going to say out of all of them, but it left us with some very useful stuff that we still use, even perhaps not consciously aware where it came from. And for example, the idea of close reading comes out of the school of new criticism. The idea of the intentional fallacy comes out of the school of new criticism. And for people who don't know, the intentional fallacy is like it kind of doesn't matter what the author meant in a way. And with that point of that is it's not that the author doesn't matter necessarily. It's that the author doesn't really always know what they intended.
Right. In this house, Paul Muad'Dib is the Lisan al-Gaib, and he is a hero. He's a
Right.
hero all the way throughout Dune 2. I need a sign.
Right. Right.
I need one of those yard signs in the
That's
rainbow
right.
colors. In this house,
That's a good one. That's a good one.
Timothy
We believe.
Chalamet. In this house, Timothy Chalamet will never experience twink death. In this house, Paul
Pretty
Muad'Dib
good.
is the hero, whatever Villeneuve says in interviews. It is not that complex,
Yeah.
people.
No, see, obviously if Denis is speaking against it, that's just more Bene Gesserit tricks.
It's more Bene Gesserit tricks, right? Of course. And it
Yeah.
would be that's exactly what the Lisan al-Gaib would say, Brad. He's
Right.
so we're setting up
Right.
for Messiah.
Right.
We're setting up for
Right.
Messiah. This is a Dune 2 podcast now.
All of them are, all of our podcasts are kind of Dune 2 podcasts.
It came up on the Fargo guest spot too.
We will talk about Dune 2. Yeah,
We're
okay.
having a good time. We're having a really
Yeah.
good time. You're doing a great job. I'm learning a lot about
Thanks, man.
Plath. Then I'm also learning a lot about the new criticism.
Yeah.
And this
Just worth
fallacy
knowing.
business is interesting. Yeah, it's like the authorial intent is like it's almost the least interesting thing in a lot of
Yeah,
ways because
it is. Yeah.
what do you take from it? I mean,
Right.
what did Shakespeare mean from mean with Hamlet? Like, do we care? I
Right.
mean, I guess scholars might, but it's more about what are we doing now with
Yeah,
it?
it's not that it's not that the author's intent sort of doesn't matter, but it's that like it's only part of the story. And I'll tell
Right.
you, like right now,
Right.
I'm working on revising my novel, and I just came to a part that I barely even remember writing, and
Right.
it's frankly it's kind of good, but I'm like, oh yeah, I forgot. I was trying to, yeah, that's right. Okay, most of it's getting done on some level that's not even conscious. So like, I don't know what I'm trying to do. I tell
Sure.
myself a story about what I'm trying to do, but it's only part of it. So, anyway, the whole reason I brought up this new criticism thing was to point out that basically Sylvia Plath is there in its not its infancy, but she's there at the kind of the beating heart of the school of new criticism. And it's probably very good for her. I think it actually really jives with the way that her mind works. And she's and kind of taking that to one side, and then again sort of thinking about her academic career. I really want to paint this picture of her and get the audience to understand, especially when she's a young woman. She has this mindset, which is a reasonable mindset and kind of admirable in a way. But she has this mindset of like, she wants to have this career as a writer. And I don't know how carefully she'd articulated the bounds of this, but she wanted to be a great writer of her time, right? And the way she saw to get there was you just work incredibly hard, and if you succeed, you will get the reward, right? She believed in a meritocratic version of things, which that's kind of what we all want it to be, but it isn't always the case, right? Um, and yet she does have some significant success at Smith. As I said, leading student at Smith who'd had already a bunch of national publications by the time she's like a sophomore in college. She's published in 17. She's published in some stuff that does magazines that don't really even exist anymore, but she was getting stuff published. Um, and actually by her junior year, she had published in Harper's Magazine. So junior in college, she had pieces in Harper's Magazine. So she was no slouch
That's
by any stretch.
yeah. Even then, that's quite a big deal. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, she would be inducted into the Phi Beta Kappa Honor Society. She became the editor of the Smith Review, which was the literary journal at Smith. That was in her senior year. And then I believe it's in her sophomore year. Um, quote, this is about her time. Like I mentioned early on, Mademoiselle, the magazine Mademoiselle, which was a big deal in her day. They nationally they went around and they basically picked girls out to be guest editors for the summer, and you would move to New York City for a few months and you would have a job at Mademoiselle. It was sort of like a it was like a internship, but more obviously a competition also, and they also like very much catered to you once you got there, right? um and so quote, I'm going to read this bit from the Red Comet. Quote, in early May, Plath finally learned that she had won one of the 20 coveted guest editorships at Mademoiselle. To Warren, that's her brother, she described her joy. Quote, I feel like a collegiate Cinderella whose fairy godmother suddenly hopped out of the mailbox and said, what is your first whoosh? And I, Cinderella, said, New York. And she winked, waved her pike staff, and said, whoosh, granted. The stint lasted from June 1 to June 26 and paid $150 minus room and board. After her New York weekend with Ray, some guy she was dating, she was, quote, excited to death at the prospect of 4 gala weeks at the women-only Barbizon Hotel, her first stay in a hotel. After she won a spot, Mademoiselle sent her a promotional primer on the magazine's history. Founded in 1935, it was the only American magazine that catered exclusively to, quote, smart young women in the 18 to 30 age group with above average education and taste. By 1953, when Sylvia went there, Mademoiselle was indeed recognized as the thinking woman's magazine. 79% of its 500,000 readers had a college background. There were nods to sexual equality. It was the first magazine to publish a, quote, jobs and future department where the career girl could search for advice, and nearly all of its senior staff members were women. Later, the magazine would publish Betty Friedan and Gloria Steinem, but in 1953, Mademoiselle mostly considered itself a pioneer in other areas. Among its long and impressive list of firsts, Plath read, I missed that bit. Oh, that's okay. Mademoiselle basically had, in addition to these other things, it had a literary tradition and published poems, stories by people that you would recognize. W.H. Auden, Catherine Ann Porter, Truman Capote, and many others. So it had that part of it, but really its sort of main commercial impetus was it was more in line with like the Ladies' Home Journal than it was the New Yorker. And it was trying to find its kind of place, right? A magazine like this had never been done before. This whole we're going to cater to smart, young, educated young women. Up until the 1950s, there weren't a whole lot of college educated young women, frankly. So it was sort of trying to find its position, and it would sometimes it'd be like, okay, this issue has like a recipe for a cake in it, but it also has like dating advice. It's kind of trying to find its footing, but selling a lot and very well read and important in sort of the history of feminism, frankly. Now, Plath was assigned, even within this, getting this prestigious position, she was assigned an even more prestigious position, which was managing editor, except she had hoped that they would allow her to be the prized fiction editor. And that did not happen. She was sort of relegated to writing about fashion, which she was, not uninterested in, but certainly not as interested in as she would have been to if she would have been the fiction editor, she thought she'd be able to meet Dylan Thomas and meet W.H. Auden and be able to be actually moving in that sphere. Much of this time at Mademoiselle makes up a big part of the Bell Jar novel. And I'm going to read part of this from the Bell Jar. It's kind of a long part, but I think it's worth, it, a couple of things kind of point out here is as I'm reading this, think about how different it is than the poetry we've read so far. And then also just kind of thinking about how this big brainy woman writing this, being in New York for the first time, having all these ideas about how she can have this, she can have it all, and all of that as we kind of read this quote. And again, The Bell Jar is her novel from 1963 that eventually sold 2 million copies. It's a piece of auto fiction. It's basically what happened in her life with the names changed and some things exaggerated. Quote.
Everybody's got one of those in them.
Yeah.
If
Yeah.
you're looking for
Yeah.
something to write, you don't know what to write, just write that thing. Just change a
Yeah.
few names and
Yeah.
I
There's a
guarantee you
thing.
got something.
Yeah, there's a thing where like she wrote it in 6 weeks, and something I was reading, everybody was amazed that she wrote it in 6 weeks, and it was like it is impressive to write anything in 6 weeks, but it's like also she just wrote down what happened. I mean, it's not like do you know what I mean? Like
Sure.
6 weeks, 6 weeks is short, but also when you just say what happened to you, there's a lot less stuff you got to figure out. Anyway, quote. I was supposed to be having the time of my life. I was supposed to be the envy of thousands of other college girls, just like me, all over America, who wanted nothing more than to be tripping about in those same size 7 patent leather shoes I'd bought in Bloomingdale's one lunch hour with a black patent leather belt and black patent leather pocketbook to match. And when my picture came out in the magazine the 12 of us were working on, drinking martinis in a skimpy imitation silver lame bodice stuck onto a big fat cloud of white tulle on some starlight roof in the company of several anonymous young men with all American bone structures hired or loaned for the occasion, everybody would think I must be having a real whirl. Look what can happen in this country, they'd say. A girl lives in some out of the way town for 19 years, so poor she can't afford a magazine. And then she gets a scholarship to college and wins a prize here and a prize there and ends up steering New York like her own private car. Only I wasn't steering anything, not even myself. I just bumped from my hotel to work and to parties and from parties to my hotel and back to work like a numb trolley bus. I guess I should have been excited the way most of the other girls were, but I couldn't get myself to react. I felt very still and very empty, the way the eye of a tornado must feel, moving dully along in the middle of the surrounding hullabaloo. There were 12 of us at the hotel. We had all won a fashion magazine contest by writing essays and stories and poems and fashion blurbs, and as prizes they gave us jobs in New York for a month, expenses paid, and piles of free bonuses like ballet tickets and passes to fashion shows and hairstylings at a famous expensive salon and chances to meet successful people in the field of our desire and advice about what to do with our particular complexions. I still have the makeup kit they gave me, fitted out for a person with brown eyes and brown hair, an oblong of brown mascara with a tiny brush and a round basin of blue eyeshadow just big enough to dab the tip of your finger in, and 3 lipsticks ranging from red to pink, all cased in the same little gilt box with a mirror on one side. I also have a white plastic sunglasses case with colored shells and sequins and a green plastic starfish sewed onto it. I realized we kept piling up these presents because it was as good as free advertising for the firms involved, but I couldn't be cynical. I got such a kick out of all those free gifts showering onto us. For a long time afterward, I hid them away, but later, when I was all right again, I brought them out, and I still have them around the house. I use the lipsticks now and then, and last week I cut the plastic starfish off the sunglasses case for the baby to play with. So there were 12 of us at the hotel, in the same wing, on the same floor, in single rooms, one after the other, and it reminded me of my dorm at college. It wasn't a proper hotel. I mean, a hotel where there are both men and women mixed about here and there on the same floor. This hotel, the Amazon, was for women only, and they were mostly girls my age with wealthy parents who wanted to be sure their daughters would be living where men couldn't get at them and deceive them. And they were all going to posh secretarial schools like Katie Gibbs, where they had to wear hats and stockings and gloves to class, or they had just graduated from places like Katie Gibbs and were secretaries to executives and simply hanging around in New York waiting to get married to some career man or other. These girls look awfully bored to me. I saw them on the sunroof yawning and painting their nails and trying to keep up their Bermuda tans, and they seemed bored as hell. I talked with one of them, And she was bored with the yachts and bored with flying around in airplanes and bored with skiing in Switzerland at Christmas and bored with the men in Brazil. Girls like that make me sick. I'm so jealous I can't speak. 19 years and I hadn't been out of New England except for this trip to New York. It was my first big chance, but here I was sitting back and letting it run through my fingers like so much water. Now, the experience at Mademoiselle serves as a kind of fulcrum on which the whole plot of the Bell Jar and in some ways Sylvia's life can kind of starts to kind of get leveraged. And that question that people ask on Twitter sometimes, what radicalized you? What radicalized Sylvia Plath was the Mademoiselle guest editor position.
Yeah, you can kind of hear it.
Mm-hmm.
And that bitterness, man, that feeling of meeting the Bermuda girls, the girls who can have been skiing in Switzerland and all the rest. That it's giving. I know. What year are we in here?
So when she has the internship, it's 1953.
Yeah, it's giving. It's right before, but definitely Mad Men. It's
Yeah.
really that kind of vibe. Maybe
Yeah.
10 years prior to Mad Men.
Yeah.
I can't remember when Mad Men kicks off, but it's like,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
fascinating. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. So,
Bit of a fish out of water thing happening.
yeah, there's a fish out of water, and she wanted to do it, and she was drawn to it. And it's not like she didn't, it's not like the glitz and stuff didn't appeal to her. It's just like she just discovered it was empty. She was discovering the whole thing about, oh, they're piling these gifted on us because it's free advertising. Like that whole thing, like everything,
Sure.
if the product is free, then you're the product kind of thing going on,
Right.
right? And then
Right.
also they're like, she's like, why do I got to write about fashion?
She was an influencer. She was a
Yeah.
reluctant influencer
Hmm.
before such a thing. Well,
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
thing existed. It just wasn't in your phone. It was in
Right.
the
It wasn't.
magazines.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So, so that, and this, frankly, like, we're going to talk more about it and when we get to our other theme, which is suicide. But remember that this whole Mademoiselle thing's going on. Now, um, uh, after she graduates from Smith, she well, and here's one thing, here's a note I need to make too, and just keep in mind how significant this is to her. She graduates from Smith. Her undergraduate thesis is entitled, quote, "The Magic Mirror, a study of the double in two of Dostoevsky's novels." And this is basically after she had more or less succumbed to the enormity of trying to write on Finnegan's Wake. She moved over to writing about two Dostoevsky novels, right? But the double was always significant to her. Like, how is that person like a mirror image of me? And if they're just like me, what does that mean? I'm less than me? Yeah, she was very interested in how this worked, and there are a number of doubles that show up in her life, including in the quasi ghost story that we're going to tell in the After Dark. Okay. Now, she graduates from Smith with an AB summa cum laude. She received a Fulbright scholarship to study at Newnham College, which is one of the two women-only colleges at Cambridge. In addition to Cambridge, she had applied to Oxford, Radcliffe, Yale, and Columbia, the Woodrow Wilson Fellowship, which was a big deal. She got into some of these, but I don't think she got the Woodrow Wilson Fellowship. Well, here's an example of the context she's in. When she applied for the Woodrow Wilson Fellowship, one of the first questions they asked her was how soon she planned on getting pregnant. And the idea was they don't want to give you this fellowship if you're just going to go run off and get pregnant the next year. So this is the kind of stuff she was sort of up against, right?
Jeez, man.
Right.
Like, when are you gonna lie back and take it, lady?
Right.
You gotta let us know.
Right. Yeah,
Right.
exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
How's
Yeah.
your cycle? Where are
Right.
you in your? Yeah, I mean
Right.
that's
It's
gnarly, dude.
right.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
It's good that we're past that for sure.
It
Yeah,
is.
yeah,
It
yeah,
is. Yeah.
yeah.
I mean,
Sylvia
yeah.
didn't need to answer that question.
No, she did not. Um, yeah, so she did reasonably well at Cambridge, but the intellectual atmosphere at Cambridge is a little bit loftier than it is at Smith, and that's no dismissal of Smith. Cambridge is sort of a storied institution, right? And to the English, she became Sylvia did kind of a campus eccentric. She was a sort of cartoon version of an American woman. Bubbly, effusive, garishly styled, extroverted. Um, she was a little bit of a charming joke, especially early on. 1954, what she called her platinum summer, she dyed her hair blonde, and she would appear on the cover of like various Cambridge magazines, not the literary journals, but like the newspaper, like modeling outfits, including a swimsuit at one point. And it's very just provocative and very much turned heads. Um, she was also writing poetry at this time, and it appeared in some of the Cambridge-based journals, and there were a handful of Cambridge-based literary journals. But most of the people who read those journals um, didn't really care for her poetry at the time, and some people even sort of mocked it. There was a review written in another one of the Cambridge journals that just out and out just made fun of her poetry at this time, basically. Um, and this is a good reminder, a good example of just how American she was, right? She had American tastes and an American manner of speaking in a lot of ways, an American manner of presentation, and just didn't fit when she shows up at Cambridge. And took her a while to sort of get there. Now, at Cambridge, she's studying literature. She's reading widely, and there are huge expectations on what she's going to be reading, how much she's going to be reading, right? And one can imagine, we don't have to go into it. One can imagine you're trying to get basically a master's degree in literature at Cambridge, what that reading list looks like. It's not light. Yeah.
Yeah, can you imagine the bibliography that you're going into? Yeah,
Yes.
it's going to be
Yeah.
gnarly.
Yeah,
Gnarly.
it's not easy. But at the same time, she was trying to get published like hard, like writing stuff for publication with the intent of it showing up in magazines. And she was selling stuff. So she's a sort of a semi-commercial poet and short story writer. Somewhat middling results compared to what would come later, but still significant. Um,
Man, I think if I went over to Cambridge, I mean, of course, it's a completely different world now. I think I would
yeah,
want to maybe fly a little under the radar. I don't know that I
yeah,
would want to end up
right.
in a Speedo on the cover of a
No,
magazine or something.
no.
It just feels like a lot to,
Yeah. Yeah,
yeah,
well,
yeah.
this is the thing. I think there's this image I think of Sylvia that we kind of talked about in the beginning of this sort of there's like a dark brooding sorceress kind of thing. And I don't think we're there yet in Sylvia. What we're in Sylvia right now is overachiever, brilliant overachiever who has to win every game that she's in, right? So it's not just the school game, which she's winning. She's got a Fulbright scholarship. She's going to, you know what I mean? She's going to Cambridge for free. She's clearly, a successful academic. But she's got to be published, and she has to be published nationally, right? She wants to be published in major magazines. Like she's striving to get in the New Yorker. But there's also a social game being played, just like at any institution, and she has to win that game too. She can't not win, right? That there's no tolerance for this. And later on, we'll see the same thing when her and Ted start to have children. She has to be the best mother possible. When they start to put together a home out in the countryside, it has to be the best home she can have. She has to win, right? And
It's like Queen of the Strivers, Striver,
right,
Striver. Yeah, I
exactly,
get it. I get
exactly,
it. Yeah,
yeah.
people can
So
relate to that.
yeah, for sure. Yeah. Now after, and I'm still kind of talking about this ambition kind of career track stuff. We got other themes we're going to bring in here, not too long. But after Cambridge, where she spent 2 years, and she marries Ted Hughes there, and we're going to talk about that in more detail later. She moves back to the United States, and in June of 1957, she's invited to teach at Smith College, her alma mater. Um, there's a bit of an adjustment period when she's doing this. I mean, there's pretty high expectations of her. She's nervous because she's teaching alongside her former mentors. And yet she becomes a fairly good, maybe kind of intense teacher. And I want to talk a little bit about this period, not because it's so biographically significant in terms of telling her story, but because this is where we get a lot of unbiased opinions about her as a person. A lot of the stuff we know about her, it's like what her mother said, what her former husband said, and those things are kind of have some biases. This is maybe a little bit less. Here's a little bit about her teaching, what she taught. One of her classes, she, quote, taught 2 chapters from William James' Varieties of Religious Experience and 5 Hawthorne short stories, including her favorite, Rappaccini's Daughter. In November, she followed these texts with Henry James' The Pupil and The Beast in the Jungle, and D.H. Lawrence's The Rocking Horse Winner, The Blind Man, The Prussian Officer, and The Princess. She ended the semester with Joyce's Dubliners. During the spring semester, she would teach Crime and Punishment, A Portrait of an Artist as a Young Man, and a miniature version of the tragedy course she took at Cambridge, which is Webster, Aristotle, Ibsen, and Strindberg. She used selections from Louis Untermeyer's 1955 Modern American and British Poetry on Hopkins, Yeats, Eliot, Thomas, Auden, Crow Ransom, and E. E. Cummings. And she had planned to teach poems by Marion Moore, Wallace Stevens, Elizabeth Bishop, Richard Wilbur, and Edith Sitwell if she had time. One of her former students recalled the reading list was one of her former students recalled was, quote, heavy, depressing stuff. To her students looking back, it must have seemed that Mrs. Hughes, or Miss Plath, as we should probably call her, already had a morbid obsession with death. Plath's teaching style drew very mixed reviews. One former student, Sally Lawrence Cotter, called her, quote, one of the best teachers at Smith, who inspired her in her a lifelong love for Henry James. Another student, Martha Sidoroff, recalled, quote, as a teacher, she was unusually sensitive to her students. Martha was impressed that Plath knew all of her students' names and nicknames, a rarity in a large freshman English class. Plath was, quote, graceful, gracious, and always seemed ready to smile. She was not at all intimidating and encouraged us to express ourselves without the fear of being chastised. Martha and another student, Judy Hoffman, invited Plath and Hughes to dinner at their dorm one night and found the couple to be delightful guests. Sylvia regaled them with stories of freezing Cambridge lecture halls and cake baking mishaps, while Ted joked that he preferred the cakes that didn't come off to those that did. Another former student, Ellen Nodelman, had a completely different experience. Quote, everyone in the class hated her, she said, echoing Plath's own sense that the students in her 9 a.m. section did not like her. Quote, she didn't joke with us. She didn't encourage us. She just walked into the classroom, put her things down on her desk, fixed a steely gaze on us, and laid down the law. Let's see. Plath's impersonality in the classroom reflected not only the masculine pedagogy of Cambridge, but a central tenet of the modernist texts she was teaching. T.S. Eliot, in his essay Tradition and the Individual Talent, had argued for the separation of personality and poetry, saying, quote, poetry is not a turning loose of emotion, but an escape from emotion. It is not the expression of personality, but an escape from personality. Plath, who would ironically be later be labeled an emotional, quote, confessional poet, adhered rigidly to this dictum in her classroom. Only 6 years older than her students and without the protective armor of his PhD, she believed that she had to embody decorum and gravity. Another former student, Phyllis Chinland, remembered Sylvia as the image of bottled up energy, total control, and intellectual discipline. Other students recalled her as conservatively and sternly dressed with her hair pulled back. They said that she was cold, extremely controlled, clipped, with a slight British accent. She'd been in Cambridge 2 years, and now she has a slight British accent. Plath did most of the talking in the class, sometimes using the Socratic method of cold calling, which intimidated some of her students. Yet, the student Ellen also said the consensus was that Plath was a very good teacher. She was rigorous, demanding, and thorough in her approach both to her students and to the literature we were reading. On November of 1957, Plath learned that one of her students, Deborah Coolidge, had hung herself by Paradise Pond. News of the suicide appeared in the Sophian, which carried Plath's article about Cambridge in the same issue. Plath said nothing about it in class. She just forged on ahead, Ellen remembered. Plath did not mention the incident in her journal. Now, one reason that's significant, they find about this girl that committed suicide on campus, and so it had been in Sylvia's class, right? And Sylvia says nothing about it. And the reason this is significant is Sylvia had already at this time almost successfully tried to kill herself and been hospitalized for months afterwards. And then this girl dies on campus and she just doesn't say a word about it.
Mama.
Yeah. Right. Right. And it's like something about you can't acknowledge it. You can't go there. You can't allow yourself to think about it. If you even mention it, maybe people will remember you. The same thing happened to you. Right. Like we're, teaching a class. That's not, I don't got nothing to do with this. Right.
Right, right. We're talking about
Yeah.
Hawthorne.
Right.
Talking about
Right.
Hawthorne.
Right. Right.
Okay.
Right.
She's inventing the new criticism.
Right.
You just don't say anything.
You don't say anything about anybody. Yeah. Yeah.
Oof.
Yeah. Yeah.
Dark.
You just stuff those feelings down. Yeah.
Mm.
Um,
Very New England. Very.
yeah. Yeah.
Mm-hmm,
Yeah.
mm-hmm. Stuff it
Yeah.
down with Brown.
Right.
Shove
Right.
it down
Right.
with Brown. Mm-hmm.
Right. Right. She wasn't quite doing that, but she could get there. So now here's the thing. She's fairly young still, right? I mean, 1957, she's 25. So she's still learning a lot about these subjects herself. So this period she's teaching at Smith ends up being this period of additional intellectual exploration. At Cambridge, she hadn't really been studying the modernists very much, and so this served as her kind of opportunity to delve into that more deeply. People like Joyce, D.H. Lawrence, Eliot Yates, and she was sharpening her aesthetic toolkit for her own poetry, though she may not have been quite aware of it. However, she was finding it difficult to balance writing and teaching together. And she would end up actually she'd end up quitting after her first year, which, if we remember, there was a lot of pressure on her. She had this notion that she had to succeed, she had to win every game, and then she quits. And the only reason she quits is because that writing poetry was ultimately the goal. And it was sort of like, well, if anything gets in the way of that, then you just jettison that. You don't do that anymore, right? Let's see. Now, I'm going to read this last little bit. This is about the last day of her class at Smith. Quote, on the last day of class, Plath's students would ask her why there was so much death, so much living death in the stories, poems, plays, and novels they've read. Her response, as she wrote in her lecture notes, probably struck her students as unusually passionate. And this is written in all caps in Sylvia's notes. Quote, death is one of the most moving and troubling experiences of life. Death in life is one of the most terrible states of existence. Neutrality, boredom become worse sins than murder, worse than illicit love affairs. Be right or wrong. Don't be indifferent. Don't be nothing. Poetry, she went on, could help us recreate worlds. Many poets, many readers live by poetry as people have lived by religion. Both are rituals, patterns that give special meaning to the most profound experiences of human life. Okay. Now,
I'm sold. I'm sold.
Yeah.
To this day, you can make poetry. I wouldn't encourage you to make it your quote unquote religion, but it's certainly it can be a spiritual practice for people. It is.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
At this
certainly.
level, it certainly is.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. 100%. Now, after quitting Smith, and at this time she's married to Ted Hughes, and again, we're going to kind of backtrack and talk about that relationship. The last part of this episode is going to be about the marriage to Ted Hughes up to Plath's death, and the sort of the story of that relationship. She would work after her teaching, after she quit Smith, she would work actually a handful of odd jobs, but eventually within like a year or so, her and her husband, Ted Hughes, were more or less self-sustaining writers, largely of poetry, which is impressive and maybe not even possible in 2024.
You'd have to be professors.
Right. And they're just writers.
That's wild. Yeah. What do we do? We're poets.
Right. Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah.
Wow.
How do you afford that? Well, I publish in the New Yorker.
I published in the New Yorker, of course, naturally.
Right.
Naturally. They pay for my poems.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
And there were times Sylvia would have like 6 poems come out in the same month in different, 2 in Harper's and 2 in the New Yorker and 1 in some smaller journal, but like all coming out simultaneously. And they would actually pay back then, right?
Unrecognizable. It's a completely different world.
Yeah.
We're always talking about that.
Yeah. Some other things that she would do just as sort of as accomplishments as we kind of round out this part of the story. We're kind of telling the Sylvia Plath ambition story right now. She would eventually win a Eugene Saxton Fellowship, which was like 20 or $30,000 in today's dollars, to help write The Bell Jar. She was featured in a BBC documentary. She was on the BBC many times for a variety of different reasons, including to be interviewed about poetry, to read poetry, to provide kind of cultural critique. She was published in basically every magazine that published poetry in the United States, particularly. And she had a volume of poems come out that was entitled Colossus. Not too shabby for a woman who died at the age of 30. Um, let's read a couple of her poems that are often considered some of her best. I'm going to read first, Kevin. I'm going to read one called Ariel, but I'm sending you one called Sheep and Fog to read after that.
The sheep are in the fog.
Yeah. Yeah.
The electric sheep are dreaming of electric fog, combining and mixing worlds here.
Mm-hmm. So I'm going to read Ariel. This came out in her collection called Ariel, which was published posthumously. So I think this one was written in 19. The book came out in 1965, but she was already. I think this was written in 1962. Ariel. Stasis in darkness, then the substanceless blue pour of tore and distances. God's lioness, how one we grow, pivots of heels and knees, the furrow, splits and passes, sister, to the brown arc of the neck I cannot catch. She drops an N-word in here. Black sweet blood mouthfuls, shadows, something else, hauls me through air, thighs, hair, flakes from my heels, white Godiva, iron peel, dead hands, dead stringencies, and now I foam to wheat, a glitter of seas, the child's cry melts in the wall, and I am the arrow, the dew that flies, suicidal at one with the drive into the red eye, the cauldron of morning.
Oof.
Yeah, she's going pretty hard. Remember that phrase, and I am the arrow, because that's going to come up later. But Kevin, take a shot at Sheep and Fog.
Let me see what I got. Sheep and Fog. The hills step off into whiteness. People or stars regard me sadly. I disappoint them. The train leaves a line of breath. Oh, slow horse, the color of rust. Hooves, dolorous bells. All morning, the morning has been blackening. A flower left out, my bones hold a stillness. The far fields melt my heart. They threaten to let me through to a heaven, starless and fatherless, a dark water. Hmm. Yeah. And then they explain it below here on allpoetry.com. I don't think
they
I
tell you
want to
what it
read.
means.
I don't think I need to, read any of that. Don't read the comments.
No, right, exactly.
Yeah.
Might be good. They might have a good
we're
explanation.
meditating on, death and the abyss and fatherlessness and.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's all right there. It's yeah. Most of Plath's poetry, it's like it's interesting because she comes out of the school of new criticism, and if you don't know anything about her life, some of her poetry seems kind of obscure. Not saying Sheep and Fog is necessarily, but some of it seems kind of obscure. But when you do know about her life, it's like I know exactly what she's talking about. But new criticism, the school she came out of, would have kind of dismissed all of that, right? So it's kind of this interesting conundrum where like new criticism kind of would sap her poetry of its actual power in a certain sense, even though that's sort of where her, or at least early, kind of her academic and intellectual heart lied. So anyway, the next phase of this episode that we're going to talk about in Sylvia Plath's life, this next theme is the theme of suicide. I'm going to read a quick poem here that she wrote in 1962 just to kind of kick this bit off. This one's called Poppies in October. Even the sun clouds this morning cannot manage such skirts, nor the woman in the ambulance whose red heart blooms through her coat so astoundingly. A gift, a love gift, utterly unasked for by a sky, palely and flamily igniting its carbon monoxides by eyes dulled to a halt under bowlers. Oh my God, what am I that these late mouths should cry open in a forest of frosts and a dawn of cornflowers? Okay. On August 24th, 1953, Sylvia Plath, she's 21, she's a student at Smith College. She would make her first medically documented suicide attempt. She had tried to kill herself by swimming out to sea in 1951, but that was sort of a half-hearted attempt. This in 1953 is serious. She was between her third and fourth year at Smith College. She had recently, as we said, this is right on the tail end of her Mademoiselle guest editorship. So she goes to New York City, she comes back, and there's a mix of things happening that eventually lead to her suicide in pretty short order. Over that summer, she had hoped to she has that internship, that guest editorship, and then she has another thing. She had hoped to enroll in her summer writing course at Harvard with the author Frank O'Connor, and submitted a story that had already been published to get enrolled. Right, you apply to this thing, and if the Frank O'Connor likes your story enough, he invites you in. She gets rejected, and this is like the first thing she's ever actually rejected from. Is this summer writing course, right? And if you take the Mademoiselle thing where it's like the thing I want is actually not even real somehow, like it's all flim flam, and then this other thing I want, I get rejected from it. Like she can't handle psychically, she can't handle all this stuff right yet.
Yeah. Sure.
Now the sad thing is that
very
later
sensitive young woman.
She really is, right?
Mm-hmm.
Both sensitive and also like a powerhouse simultaneously, and so she's constantly like teetering because of this. It's kind of one kind of sad irony to this is Frank O'Connor, and I'm pointing out this rejection because it's literally like one of these, the whole straw that broke the camel's back. It's not quite the straw, but it's like definitely in the pile. Like without this rejection, she might not have attempted to kill herself. I think there's an argument for that. Frank O'Connor was interviewed years later about her rejection, right? All these people are sort of trying to piece together Sylvia Plath's life. And he said, "Oh, we rejected her because we thought she was too good for the class. Like there was nothing for her to learn." And you kind of like, maybe you could have told her that, right? Like maybe just mention that in the letter when you reject her. Like, hey, by the way,
I'm not. Have you ever received a rejection? Because I have had rejection letters where it's like this play's too finished. Like we don't.
I've had
because a lot of stuff. It's like it's like, but still, okay, I guess. No, but I think it needs more work. Right. I mean, whatever. I mean, sometimes they get sort of killing them softly. But yeah, that's crazy. They could have told her that. That would have probably helped her ego.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So anyway, now. A big thing that was going on in this part of her life too, she'd had this long-term love affair with a guy named Dick Norton, who she was now realizing she was never going to marry. And she had a major mutual crush on another guy who had just left for naval training, right? So she's sort of lovelorn and confused about that. The whole I keep saying it's an internship because that's sort of what it was, but the whole Mademoiselle thing is all BS, rejection from the Harvard school, right? So all these factors, in addition to her temperament, I think, and whatever was kind of drawing her in this direction, leads to a pretty significant depressive episode. Not her first depressive episode, but up until now, by far her most serious. And so for a while in this summer between junior and senior year, unlike her normal like hyperproductivity, she's sort of doing nothing all day. She would sunbathe and sort of lay around, and she tried to read, but the words just sort of didn't get into her head. And she was freaked out about the fact that she couldn't seem to get any creative work done. And she'd never really had writer's block before. So to her, it was like, will I ever be able to do it again? She didn't realize that, yeah, sometimes you just don't write for a week or two. It's not the end of the world, right? You'll be fine. She wrote it to herself in her journal in July of 1953. She wrote this, quote, "Please think, snap out of this. Believe in some beneficent force beyond your own limited self. God, 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 where are you? I want you, need you. The belief in you and love and mankind. You must not seek escape like this. You must think." This was the last journal entry she would write for nearly 2 years. And the only reading she seemed to be able to accomplish at this period in July 1953 The only thing seemed to be able to read was a book of essays entitled Modern Abnormal Psychology, where she took a lot of notes about an essay on the subject of schizophrenia. And I point this out to point out one thing that there's this way in which Sylvia Plath's whole life is sort of prescient for how we live now in a certain sense. Not only the influencer thing that you mentioned, Kevin, which I think is a factor, but also this idea of like, what if we just read a lot about mental illness? If you read enough about mental illnesses, you end up with one. In a certain sense, right? Because you find the thing that you're sort of like,
It's
and
very similar. If you listen to enough podcasts, you end up starting a podcast. So be very, very well, continue listening.
sure,
And
yeah,
yeah. And if you have a
yeah,
good idea, go for it. Go for it.
yeah,
Just,
yeah,
sometimes put the DSM down. Don't
right.
listen to podcasts and read the DSM at the same time.
That's a recipe for disaster.
You
Yeah,
really don't want to be doing
yeah,
that. Don't be
yeah,
reading Freud's case studies and listening to Cometown.
right.
Or
Yeah,
Rogan.
yeah, right,
Yeah,
yeah,
you can always listen to Art of Dark. So we're a
mhm.
safe space.
Yeah, of course, yeah,
Okay, I'm just planting
yeah.
seeds
We
here.
never give you an
But
info hazard or
no, we
anything.
never.
Yeah,
There's no info hazards on Art of Darkness. And by the
yeah,
way, we're on the question of suicide. Of course, always, if you're ever thinking about it, always go get help. I know this is a cliche, but really, seriously,
hmm
it's never worth it. It's never the answer.
hmm
And really, seriously, we cover a lot of suicides. Artists, great artists. There seems to be a tendency toward it, and
yeah.
it's never anything to glamorize or. And we do take it
No.
seriously, even though we joke. You don't want to leave this world when you're 30 years old, and
hmm
there's nothing but help out there. So for
hmm
real. And
hmm
if you've got a gift like Sylvia, and even if you
Yeah,
don't, you maybe haven't just realized your gift. And
yeah.
I really meant what I said about that novel too. Like everybody's got that. Everybody's got one great work of art in them. I really believe it,
Oh,
even
I
if
think
it's
that's true.
naive, however
Yeah.
naive, however So hey, no,
hmm
nobody has permission to. Certainly, no Art of Darkness listener has permission to pull a Sylvia.
No.
Just close the oven and go
Yeah.
take a walk. That's
Yeah.
my advice. That's my
Yeah.
recommendation.
Oh
Anyway, Brad,
yeah.
you're in the
Yeah.
thick of it. But yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
No, no,
yeah.
I
Mm.
appreciate you doing that. I would have not done that just trying to tell the story, but
Well,
you're absolutely
we
right.
always forget it, and it's like
Yeah.
really, and it's seriously, and people are out. We're living really, really gnarly times, man. I mean, it's
hmm
really tough out there. So just
Yeah.
don't, we're never prescribing an
No.
exit on this podcast ever. So
No.
yeah, yeah,
No.
yeah, yeah.
So the same day, talking about this period right leading up to immediately before her suicide attempt. So there's that same day she wrote that journal entry about sort of begging herself to snap out of this. She she's living at home with her mom because it's summer break. She gashes up her legs with a razor. And she told her mother, Aurelia, that she just wanted to see if she had the guts to do it. And when her mother confronted her, Sylvia said this: "Oh, mother, the world is so rotten. I want to die. Let's die together, can we?" Um, and a week later, Aurelia took Sylvia to visit a psychiatrist, as that's probably the right thing to do. At this point, Sylvia showed up not having bathed in days and having hardly eaten anything in the previous 3 weeks. And on July 29th, 1953, they committed her into Valley Head Hospital north of Wellesley in the town of Carlisle for the first round of electroshock therapy. Now we're going to talk about electroshock therapy here a little bit. So this isn't, as we mentioned, we've covered some other writers who had ECT. Ernest Hemingway's was significant, and probably Ernest Hemingway and Sylvia Plath are kind of the same. I mean, I know we talked in that episode that kind of part of the reason Ernest Hemingway committed suicide, at least a contributing factor, was he did not want to get shocked again. Am I mistaken in thinking that, Kevin?
Well,
Is
so the way Hemingway's timeline was, I think it was at the end of 1960, he received the kind of old-fashioned ECT halfway against his will at
Mhm,
Mayo Clinic down here in Rochester, Minnesota, where he was
mhm,
awake. And then some months later in 61, and I may be getting these years wrong, but I think that's correct. He was sort of brought to the Mayo against his will again, and then
mhm,
he tried to like walk into the propeller of the plane when they refueled, and he was trying to like jump out of the plane. He was going nuts. It was either the first time or the second time. He might have been more docile the second time. I don't have the
mhm.
whole timeline like
Yeah.
handy, but then the second time he was sedated, when they gave him the ECT, and then he played along to get out, and it was like 4 or 5 days later in Idaho where the shotgun went off. So
Right. And
it didn't, whatever it was supposed to do for Hemingway, it did not do it for him. And again, they'll still give this treatment if there are people with impossible suicidal depression.
Yeah.
This is a treatment they'll do, but of course they sedate you now, and they're not going to do it to you against your will. They're not going to do it to you.
The voltages are a lot lower too. Yeah.
That makes sense. I think it's more of a consistent therapy that you receive over time, and they're not going to do it because, you're a woman and you want to wear slacks.
Right.
It's different now.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I want to wear slacks.
Yeah.
Take it.
Yeah.
You're going to take we're the Ghostbusters,
Right.
God, she wants to wear pants.
Right.
Can't have it.
Exactly. And there was a lot of that in the 1950s and earlier.
Oh, sure.
And before that, and there were still some lobotomies being performed in the early 1950s. And there was probably a risk at one point that they might have done that to Sylvia. But yeah, the electroshock thing was like, yeah, okay. It's one thing when a young woman, she has she's talking about, hey, I'm going to kill myself like right now. That's one thing. And, who knows it's not clear what the best thing to do is in that situation. Right. But there were many, many cases of women who it was like, yeah, so it turns out that she doesn't really, like you said, she wants to wear slacks. Turns out that she's being kind of whiny about doing the laundry. Maybe we should just, can we electrocute her? Maybe then she'll be cool with it. There's real,
she's hysterical. Weird... She raised her voice at me after I came home from bowling with the boys.
Right.
This happens every Friday. She keeps raising her voice.
Yeah, exactly.
I doctor, I don't like it. I don't know what to do.
Yeah.
If she doesn't stop, it's going to get real serious.
Yeah.
I can't promise that I can electrocute her.
Can we electrocute her?
Can we electrocute this woman? She's got the Togos keeps swirling around the toilet.
and
keeps putting her feet up.
This is a prime example of us laughing. Like, that is so fucked up.
It's fucked up.
That's why we're laughing. Is how absurd
it's just so absurd.
Yeah.
And of course, there's nothing today that we will look back on. Nothing
there's
today is
bizarre,
going. No, there's no weird, bizarre medical problems. People aren't.
To enforce your like a gender thing.
Okay. No. Brad, hush.
Oh, okay.
Okay. Go back to sleep, Brad.
Yeah. Okay.
Go back to sleep. Okay. Go. Yeah. I've just said him like Emperor Palpatine here through the inner tubes. Brad. We want to have a show for a long time, buddy.
Right. Yes.
Yeah, but we're so much more enlightened now, is my point.
Obviously.
And the medical community really has, the public health community, they really have our best interests in mind now. We know better now.
Yeah.
Going on mute.
Yeah. Now the ECT in this early form, back like when Sylvia had it and before, real rough, no anesthesia, no muscle relaxants. It was not uncommon for someone and they're getting shocked, to like seizure and convulse so much that they broke their back. Like, not uncommon. There's like a reasonable chance that could happen.
Doggy.
Very high voltages, high frequency. I mean, often, right? They would do it and then they do it the next day, right? And yeah, so I think we kind of touched on that. I don't know if I got much more to say on it. But let's read a little bit about from the Red Comet biography on this. Quote, indeed, a promotional article for McLean. Now, she didn't get her first ECT treatment at McLean. She got her first treatment at Valley Head, but she would later go to McLean, and we're going to get to that part of the story. But this is an interesting little bit. Indeed, a promotional article from McLean that appeared in the Boston Globe in 1964 outlined a situation where a middle-class wife might benefit from a short McLean stay. This was in their promotional material for this mental hospital in 1964. Quote, she is irritable and impatient with her husband and children. She thinks she can't cook any longer or take care of household duties. The article showed a photograph of the woman's therapy, cooking in the McLean kitchen. She was released when she is better able to handle her home responsibilities and continue her voluntary job as a typist. The article depicts with brutal accuracy the pre-Freudian equation of female sanity with domestic proficiency. Indeed, the term depression was not used in most British and American women magazines in the 1950s. Articles instead referred to nervous exhaustion, mental conflict, or anxiety and nervous tension. These were the types of phrases Aurelia would supply to reporters from the Boston Globe when Sylvia went missing in August. We're going to talk about that story. It is probably no accident that the Bell Jar's heroine, Esther Greenwood, shares the same name as the unjustly maligned woman in Charlotte Perkins Gilman's feminist short story, An Unnatural Mother. Esther's literary ambitions make her appear unnatural to her male doctors, and Plath wrote the novel, The Bell Jar, in 1961 when she was herself struggling to balance motherhood and writing. Now, Valley Head, where she was first given treatment in 1953, was probably the worst place she could have ended up in the entire state. Some of its doctors, in fact, had a reputation as shock artists who performed electroshock for profit and short-term benefits. Because this is the thing, you weren't trying to treat like, oh, she's having an issue. Maybe we can figure out how to like help her. It's like if you like. Okay, here's the thing to think about with electrocution, and this is simplifying it. When you go back to like B.F. Skinner and early days of like behavioral research, what did they do to try and train the mouse? Well, you give them a little electroshock. And if you give them a little electroshock at the right time with the right kind of incentives, you can train them to do anything you want. It's a lot more like that than it was like maybe we can reset some kind of electrochemical balance in their head and they'll feel better. It was a lot more like behavioral manipulation. And it's like, do you want to get electrocuted again? Okay, well, how do you think you should act in order to not get electrocuted again? That's what it was more like in the early days.
Boy. And again, man,
Yeah.
the system really onboarded that stuff and uses
Mhm.
it in lots of different places in lots of different ways.
Yeah.
It's not subtle.
Yeah. And then you think about like, okay, how does the treatment end? Well, when you're cured, okay, she's not people aren't stupid, right?
The treatment ends when you post a banger.
Right.
The treatment ends when you get 50 retweets on a
Yeah.
banger. That's when the treatment ends. And then, but you got to come back next week. You got to post another banger.
Yeah. It's not easy to do. Keep a
No,
banger after banger like that,
you've
Kevin.
got to keep that dopamine drip. You're like a little
Yeah.
mouse. You just got
Yeah.
to keep that.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
please, that
Yeah.
attention. Ooh. Oh, I feel so good. How many listeners do we have to the
Yeah.
pod?
Yeah.
It's good.
Yeah.
Good subscribers. Oh, good. You know, my point is, I mean, again, like this is everywhere. This is
Mhm.
everywhere now.
Mhm.
Everywhere. It's
Mhm.
just not, but boy, you don't want to get jammed up in the prison system because they use it there too. I guarantee
Oh,
it.
I'm sure they
Oh yeah,
do.
they have
Yeah.
all this stuff. They got PhDs working to make sure that you're going exactly where they want at all times, and
Yeah.
consumer PhDs and all this other stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
No bueno.
Yeah.
Brad, I don't like that this is happening to our Sylvia, man.
No.
I'm really, really not thrilled with this.
No. Now
Yeah.
let me read you a little bit. So Sylvia, this is from Red Comet. Quote, this is after her first ECT. Quote, Sylvia woke up alone after the procedure, which felt like an electrocution, and was returned to her mother in the waiting room. There was apparently no talk therapy between sessions, just a prescription for sleeping pills later administered by Dr. Kenneth Tillotson, who took over the treatments after Dr. Thornton went on vacation. Many of the horror stories the public eventually heard about ECT and lobotomy came out of institutions where such therapies were wantonly prescribed and inexpertly administered, wrote McLean's historian. According to Dr. D. Marneff, once the most preeminent psychiatrist in Boston, Plath was a casualty of such wantonness. Her 1961 notes on the Bell Jar calls Dr. Jordan fictional, though botched shock treatment real. So if you read the Bell Jar and you read the sections about the ECT, that was actually what happened. So people who've read that book will know. Uh, yeah, here is specifically the bit from the Bell Jar. Quote, Dr. Jordan was fitting two metal plates on either side of my head. He buckled them into place with a strap that dented my forehead and gave me a wire to bite. I shut my eyes. There was a brief silence, like an indrawn breath. Then something bent down and took hold of me and shook me like the end of the world. Whee! It shrilled through an air crackling with blue light, and with each flash, a great jolt drubbed me till I thought my bones would break and the sap fly out of me like a split plant. I wondered what terrible thing it was I had done. So,
From Cambridge to that
yeah,
table
yeah,
in the blue light.
yeah. Well, this
Man,
is
what a
technically
world.
before Cambridge, but yeah,
Oh,
she's
this is
at
before
Smith.
Cambridge.
Yeah,
Okay. I
yeah.
got you. Okay.
She's still a world
Still.
beater. She's 17 years or
Damn.
she's 20 years old. Yeah.
Okay, I'm getting the timeline out of order, but
Yeah, and
still, like that's
I've done
yeah,
this
yeah,
to
yeah.
I've
No, I
I've
know,
done
I
this
know
to you
you've
by the
done
way
this
of
on
putting this
purpose.
episode
Yeah, yeah,
together.
you've
Yeah.
done this on purpose. But that's
What
still
terrible
like,
thing have you done, Kevin? Yeah.
uh,
No comment. Yeah.
you just click the button and you got to pick the timeline. You got to pick how
Right.
far back you want to go. It's like looking
Right.
at like Google
Right.
Analytics. We going
Mhm.
back to January?
Yeah. Yeah. So far
Which
today, pretty
January?
good.
Today,
Yeah.
pretty good. Today, I said my prayers and I
There you
took a
go.
shower, and here
Yeah.
I am.
There you go.
I made the podcast on time. I'm sober.
Hey, it's great, Ken. Hey,
Yeah,
you're
yeah, yeah.
batting a yeah. All
Yeah,
right.
batting 1,000 here, buddy.
Yeah.
I mean, you
Yeah.
don't have to shock me. You don't. Again, though. But I gotta confess, I haven't posted a banger in a while.
Ooh. Yeah. Yeah. That's oh, clock is ticking.
We gotta
Yeah.
call the doctor.
Oh, I read something in this that I meant to look into, and I apparently at one point Jacqueline Kennedy got ECT, and it was immediately after an argument with Jack, with John F. Kennedy.
Crazy.
They had some crazy argument. He's like, "Well, maybe we could electrocute you."
I
That helps. Does that help?
it's just so like it's just so strange that it was so normalized.
Mm.
I'd be very curious. That would be an interesting episode to do as a bonus sometime. Would just be to do like a 45-minute, hour-long episode on the history of ECT. Would be fascinating. It's a different
Yeah,
podcast,
yeah, it is,
but
but it is
but
interesting. Yeah.
yeah, I'm very curious about this. Like, when did it kick off? Why did they think, I'm sure it's just gee whiz bang,
It was. That's part of
electricity,
it.
yeah,
If
like,
they
wow,
could have, if they could have
electricity, yeah,
somehow, if they could in the 50s, if they could have somehow nuked your brain, but also
sure.
not killed you, they
Right,
would have.
right, right. Can we
Yeah.
radiate the brain?
Right. Yeah.
Let's try to radiate the brain
Yeah.
and see if she'll do more dishes.
Right. Right. Oh, yeah.
I saw a tweet. I saw a tweet today. It's very funny. It kind of went viral. It was very funny. It said Benjamin Franklin electrocuted himself with a kite, and he was considered the most intelligent person in Philadelphia. Oh gosh, America.
Oh,
Good
that's
one.
really good.
Good one.
Whew. So, oh man. So at Valley Head, she would have at least two of these ECT treatments. Um, she it does make her more placid and less like actively depressed because it did take her out of like I'm gonna kill myself right now. It took her out of that mode, right? But it like every time it happened, she felt like she was like losing a piece of herself, and apparently the pain is just overwhelming if you're not that. I mean, have you ever shocked yourself like on an electrical socket or
Oh
something?
yeah, like
It's not
accidentally.
fun.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and then but like that, what sustained for a period of time
right.
and
Throughout your
in
body,
your
like
head.
times
Yeah,
10.
sure. Yeah,
Yeah,
no good. Yeah,
no.
highly
Yeah.
would want to avoid.
And
Yeah.
so what does she start thinking? She starts thinking, maybe I'll just kill myself so I don't have to do this anymore. Right. Here is a little bit of a poem called The Hanging Man. She wrote this, I think, in the late 50s. The Hanging Man. By the roots of my hair, some god got hold of me. I sizzled in his blue volts like a desert prophet. That's such a good. I'm going to read that line, those two lines again. By the roots of my hair, some god got hold of me. I sizzled in his blue volts like a desert prophet. The night snapped out of sight like a lizard's eyelid, a world of bald white days and a shadeless socket. A vulturous boredom pinned me in this tree. If he were I, he would do what I did. Okay. Now, Okay, so if they're so intolerable, and we're kind of beating this drum a lot about this ECT and this weird treatment, but I think it's really important. So if they're so intolerable, these treatments, I think a modern person might say, well, why would she go? Why'd she do them? Well, here's something from Red Comet. Quote, because she had no choice, fearing that if she resisted her shock treatments, she would be institutionalized. In 1953, this was a very real possibility. Indeed, the number of American psychiatric inpatients peaked in 1953 at a little over 500,000. She was at the mercy of a patriarchal medical system that assumed that highly ambitious, strong-willed women were neurotic. As women, she and her mother had no power to defy the system. The doctor knew best. Indeed, Aurelia allowed Dr. Thornton to administer the shock treatments despite her own misgivings about both his inexperience and the procedure itself. Uh, Peter Aldrich, a family friend, remembered his mother telling him that, quote, Sylvia really hated to go, but she knew she had to. Sometimes Aurelia had to force her into the car. I thought, what are they doing to her? My only glimpse of her after treatment was one day when she was coming out of my mother's car and she seemed uncharacteristically lifeless. It was just not like her. And I thought to myself, that's not Sylvia. What had they done to her? Sylvia seemed subdued, he remembered, out of it, almost like a zombie. Peter Aldrich remembered that after the treatment, she would disappear inside the house for hours, which was unusual as she normally spent so much time outside sunbathing. His mother, Betty Aldrich, hated driving Sylvia and Aurelia to Valley Head, but she felt sorry for the family and did what she could to help. So, um, yeah, you're muted there, Kevin.
So 1953. Is this 1953?
Yeah, yeah,
You're saying 500,000 people
in the
were
country.
in mental institutions.
Like that sounds low.
It's there were 160 million people in the
Oh,
country, so
right.
that means that like it says
That's
it's like
crazy.
that's
That would be like a
crazy.
million people being inside now, basically.
Yeah, a little more. Yeah, that's
Yeah,
crazy.
that is
I
crazy.
mean, and they shut these things down, of course, and we've got problems. Like there are
Right.
downstream consequences from this, but yeah,
Yeah.
man, cuckoo's nest. It's
Yeah.
it's cuckoo's nest time.
Yeah, for sure.
Man,
It
this
really is.
country, this country is something else, dude.
Yeah.
It's not what they told us it was,
Oh,
and it's not
yeah.
what it seems to be at all, and
And
it's never been.
which is interesting, like historically, and this is broad brush, and I don't totally understand all of it, but like the history of that is like, well, it seems like a problem. We got all these people. What was the solution? You just shut them down and let everybody
Just
out.
shut them down. Let them.
Like,
We'll
oh,
just
well,
let
wait,
the
wait, wait.
prison.
Actually,
Yeah,
some of those people did have problems. Like,
some of those people actually need to be. Yeah, yeah.
they
The
need
churches
something.
and the families, and so
Yeah.
no, no. Don't worry. The prison system will pick it up. The
Right.
prison
No, no.
system and
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, the
Yeah.
rehab archipelago and
Yeah.
yeah, all it's dude, it's a mess out there. Everybody knows too.
Hmm.
And it
Hmm.
was Reagan in California, and it actually was the Cuckoo's Nest movie had a huge influence on
Yeah.
that movement. I mean, yeah, of course, nobody, yeah, well, what a
Yeah.
mess, man. What
Yeah.
are we gonna do?
Yeah.
We
Totally.
don't have any answers for this on this podcast. We just know
No.
it's a problem.
No, and this is we're kind of zooming in on this part of it, right? Of the problem. So August 24th, 1953, this is about a month after her first ECT treatment. Sylvia Plath broke into her mother's medicine cabinet and took a bottle of sleeping pills. She wrote a note for her mother, who she'd coaxed out of the house to attend the theater, that read, quote, have gone for a long walk. We'll be home tomorrow. And then she crawled into the home's crawl space, replaced the stack of firewood behind her, and swallowed 40 pills. Now, there's a great page or two, and I just this is a great because it's very well written bit in the bell jar describing this experience of going to do it. So, but we're going to kind of skip over that for the sake of time. I would just say that that's to me is one of the most masterful parts in the whole of the bell jar. So it's worth reading for that, and also thinking about the fact that in 1963 a woman is writing openly about her suicide attempt, among other things, in this book, The Bell Jar. And that's one of the reasons it was so popular. It was sort of this was taboo subjects for
And
people
that
to write
that
about.
move to go into the crawl space and pull firewood behind you, and
Hmm.
it's just so I don't know, taking
Yeah.
40 pills and
Hmm.
what ended up happening? She must have thrown them up,
Yeah,
or
well, here, let me finish this.
all
So,
right, all
so
right.
her mother discovers the note and she immediately knows that something's wrong. I mean, her daughter's been ECT treatments and she sees a letter that says, "Gone for a long walk, be back tomorrow." Like, what are you talking about? Right? So, anyway, over the next day, more than 100 friends, neighbors, and even a Boy Scout troop combed the nearby roads and woods and aqueducts. It showed up in 253 newspaper articles across the country with a headline something like "Beautiful Smith Girl Missing at Wellesley." And it was on television. They had bloodhounds. They would have had helicopters if that was a thing back then. It was like a national news event to some degree, right? And they're searching for, obviously they're searching for, and then let me read this bit. August 26th, so this is 2 days after she to them, the family, she's gone missing. They don't know what's happened to her. On August 26th, the family was at the table trying miserably to eat lunch. You imagine your daughter's somewhere out there in the world, you don't know, and you're like, I still got to eat a fucking sandwich, I guess. Like,
Well, I
right.
mean, there's never been a bad sandwich.
That's true. That's true. Um, Pat was ironing, making herself use. That's a friend, making herself useful. Suddenly, they heard a beagle howling right outside the house. Warren pounded the table and said, "Damn it, I'm going to get rid of that dog. I just can't stand it." Warren is her brother. He stood up to go outside and chase the dog when Pat said, quote, "It struck him and all of us at the same instant that the dog was trying to tell us something. We all zoomed into the basement. Warren found Sylvia in the crawl space. She had taken too many pills and vomited them up. Call the ambulance," he shouted to them. According to the Wellesley police report, the station received a call that Plath had been found and was requesting an ambulance. Soon, paramedics, along with Chief McBay, and had Plath on a stretcher and on her way to Newton Wellesley Hospital, where she had volunteered just a few weeks before. Sylvia had cut her skin under her right eye when she woke up and banged her face, and it had become infected in the August heat. Um, Apparently, there is uh, Plath told a friend of hers that the reason that her eye was all gashed up, they'd said that she woke up and like accidentally hit her head. She said that when she told her friend that when she woke up and realized she wasn't dying, that she bashed her face against the bottom of the house trying to kill her, like trying to finish. I mean,
Oh my God, how uncomfortable and awful and
hmm
oh,
hmm
that's a really dark suicide attempt,
it is.
man.
It is.
There's yeah.
And here's the
Oh,
thing. Sylvia felt like she was a burden on her family, which many suicides they do. They feel like they're a burden on the family, right? And
mm,
Aurelia, when she got her daughter back, she told Sylvia, she said how much she loved her and how happy they were that she was back and all of this. And Sylvia answered, "It was my last act of love," trying to kill herself. That was how she
mm,
perceived it. Taking
mm,
herself out of this would be good for everyone, right?
mm.
It's just not that way. It's basically 0% of the time is it that way. Is that actually true when people, but it's a narrative loop that suicide people get stuck in.
Right,
It's just
right,
not
right,
true.
right.
Um, so she woke up in the hospital, Newton Wellesley Hospital. She was frantic because she was worried about the cost of her medical care, right? Which nothing changes, right?
Mm,
Ambulance
sure.
ride and search parties and all this stuff. And like suddenly she's worried about being a burden. I mean, this is a burden, right? All of this. She asked her mom, one of the first things she asked her mom was like, "Did you have to sell the house?" She was worried that her mom would have to sell the house in order to like pay for all of this stuff.
Mm,
Um, yeah. And it's interesting. It just kind of draws in contrast. She's a Smith girl, and she has all the pose of this sort of like an Ivy Leaguer, but they don't have any of the money, right? They're not, they're
sure,
not well
sure.
off. Now, one thing that happens here is, the scholarship that Sylvia had been at Smith under was actually paid for by this author named Olive Higgins Prudy, who was like a bestseller in her day and was still alive at the time. I think she was in her 70s at this point. She takes a special interest in Sylvia and she ends up paying some of her school and through the scholarship, but also she says, "We're going to get Sylvia into McLean and I will pay for it." Right. So this is how she ends up in McLean. Now, the next these two topics of suicide and institutionalization, they're kind of related, but we're going to talk about the institutionalization part here. She ends up in McLean Hospital from September 1953 to January 1954. So it's pretty decent. It's like 4 months. It's a good stretch of time. McLean, we talk a little bit about it in our David Foster Wallace episode because he spent some time there as well. This is a famous psychiatric hospital in Belmont, Massachusetts. It's the kind of, I made this sort of a half joke in my notes. It's kind of the Yaddo of mental hospitals, to be honest.
Yaddo, and Yaddo is the mental hospital of writers' retreats and conferences. Right. I've heard.
Sure. Yeah.
I've never been invited.
Yeah.
Brad, you've got to try to get into Yaddo. You've got to try to infiltrate. You have to do an Alex Jones at Bohemian Grove style expose, Art of Darkness special expose of Yaddo. They're drinking again. Right. The writers are drinking again. They're throwing axes. They're throwing axes. They're supposed to be here writing. They're throwing axes. Right. There's a fire. There's a campfire. There seems to be some extramarital flirtation. I'm seeing some footsie. They're worshiping a giant owl.
That would be a funny tweet. My God, I think some of these people might be having sex with each other.
I feel like there might be some of these writers at a conference maybe having extramarital affairs. You're just put it on a DVD. It's like you doing a Blair Witch thing,
grainy
through
footage.
The woods. Yeah. Oh God, they're into the scotch again. Writers drink and fuck. That's the joke. And they're people like anybody else. No, right? No, we're Boy Scouts.
Yeah. Well, also, this she's like. Anyway, never mind.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm trying to make a little yuck.
Of course. Mm-hmm. And the reason I say it's the Yaddo of mental health hospitals is because Robert Lowell was committed to McLean, who we talked about in Flannery O'Connor episode, that kind of some of that. David Foster Wallace, as we mentioned, but the mathematician John Nash spent time at McLean Hospital, the musician James Taylor, Ray Charles, Anne Sexton, who is actually one of Anne Sexton is another double. She's a Sylvia Plath double. And Sylvia Plath met Anne Sexton. It was like there's a weird yin yang thing, and she encountered a number of these people. But so that's what I'm saying. Like a lot of talented artists and people of other talents ended up at McLean Hospital. It's one of these places, and it's been around for a long time. It's one of these places when it was built in 1811, it was just called the Asylum for the Insane. It was built to keep the growing number of insane people off the streets of Boston. Nowadays, like current day, McLean is considered among the top mental institutions in the country, if not the world. But in the middle of the 20th century, it had a much more mixed reputation. It was struggling to keep up with new treatments, and it had a reputation as a backwater that indulged its patients' idiosyncrasies. Because one of the things is it was very expensive at the time, and it gets a little blurry. These patients are paying, their families generally are paying lots and lots of money for them to be there. It gets a little blurry. Like, are they here to be treated, or are they customers who are always right? And will their rich uncle pull them out if he senses that they're not being treated well? It gets kind of confusing, right? And so sometimes things happen because we want to keep the patient here, frankly. And we want to keep them happy and placid and, that kind of thing. And it's also a place that looks, even if you find pictures of it now, it looks more like a college campus than it does like whatever your stereotype of a mental institution might. But here's something from the Red Comet biography by Heather Clark, quote, "But McLean was not Baden-Baden." Baden-Baden's a sort of famous resort town in Germany. More dangerous therapies like subcoma insulin and electroshock treatment were frequently practiced. In 1953, 87 patients received shock treatments and 70 received insulin. There were even 4 lobotomies that year, the last year that they were performed at McLean. So the year Sylvia's there, that's where they performed the last lobotomies. So the notion that she could have been lobotomized is not far-fetched by any means. Sylvia could not have known the hospital would discontinue the practice, and the prospect terrified her. Excuse me. Electroshock treatment, only in use for about 13 years, was a risky procedure and not well understood. Some patients responded well to it and returned to a normal life. Others did not. McLean's director of internal medicine, Dr. Mark Altschul, wrote in 1953 that the hospital was testing certain drugs for use in shock treatment that would prevent, quote, potentially fatal reactions. McLean's doctors were reluctant to use shock treatments on fellow physicians, which suggests their discomfort with the shock treatment on fellow physicians. Oh, wait, sorry. McLean doctors were reluctant to use shock treatments on fellow physicians as like tests, which suggests their discomfort with the procedure. Another thing that apparently they were doing was some a treatment that was basically hypothermia. You would just like just sit you in a super cold bath for the day and see if that helps. And there like wasn't like much theoretical grounding for it.
We're gonna treat you. We're gonna treat you like a first round draft pick
right?
After a 2 a day.
Yeah.
And where you're get in the cold bath.
Yeah. No, you can't. Yeah. Except like, no, you can't get out. No.
Oh, right. Yeah. You have to stay in. Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Until the Sports Center guys aren't here yet. We gotta wait for the interview. Yeah.
Yeah. Another thing they were doing was at McLean Hospital in the 50s was something called Neptune's girdle, which they basically take like freezing wet towels and just wrap you in them and then you just hung out in that.
Neptune's girdle.
Very poetic turn of phrase.
Yeah, that is. Yeah,
and
no good.
Interestingly, in one of these test runs, they were trying to figure out if this hypothermia treatment worked. One of the doctors did it on several people, and 4 people had positive results, and 1 person died. And they're like, "Oh, okay, well, it's good, might work. It's an option."
Yeah, the Togo strikes again.
Yeah, that's right.
It happens. It just happens.
Right.
What could you say? It's America. We got electricity. We got nuclear power.
Yeah,
we won the war.
Right.
We won the war. We had with nothing. Medicine. We won the war.
It's science.
I'm gonna write a song. Medicine, science. We won the war. Get in the freezing cold tub.
Get in the freezing cold tub. You get out when we say you're better. Yeah. Now,
man, and this was not that far ago. I mean, this is not that long ago. We're not that far.
It's in my parents' lifetime.
We're not that far away from this, man.
Yeah.
God damn.
Now, at McLean, Sylvia Plath was given a provisional diagnosis of, quote, psychoneurotic disorder, depressive reaction. It sounds reasonably accurate. And was declared sane, but was determined to be suffering from, quote, delayed adolescent turmoil. Aren't we all?
My God.
Yeah. she
just a little for you Zoomers out there, just so you know, that could go on into your 40s.
Yeah, it's true. It's true. She was treated by an at the time 30-year-old psychiatric resident named Dr. Ruth Boucher, or sometimes named Barnhouse. She's referred to as both because of marriage stuff. This is a woman from whom Sylvia would receive treatment and or at least correspond with for the rest of her life. Barnhouse was kind of still learning on the job. And she was kind of skeptical of psychoanalysis. She didn't use Freudian terms. She used Thorazine and talk therapy, right? Sometimes art therapy and other kind of occupational therapies, as she did with Sylvia. Apparently the best thing to do with Sylvia at this time was to just like get her to paint, and she would just like kind of start chatting, and then, you just kind of have a conversation about it. Her conclusion was that Plath was basically depressed because she could not reconcile her literary ambitions with the societal/internal pressure to marry, which is probably pretty decent analysis. Like we said before, like she's, there's this, Sylvia wasn't one of these people who was like, I want to forego family to focus on my career. She wanted the family and she wanted the career. And this is why I kind of positioned her as this sort of like this very modern woman. She wanted them both. And there wasn't a space for that. There weren't even a lot of role models for that. So it caused her some strife. Let's see. One of the treatments they did use for her, though, were insulin treatments. Now, a lot of people would give, particularly schizophrenics at the time, were being given huge doses of insulin that would basically put them into a coma. nobody, I'm not even sure what the point was exactly. Like it's another, you freeze them, you electrocute them, you shoot them full of insulin. Like sometimes it works. Again, I think a lot of this is like not even really realizing it, but you're carrying out a behavioral like manipulation on people. It's just like you're acting this way. We're gonna quote treat you with something traumatizing until you act right. And then like sometimes it works and you're like, see, it works. I really think that's kind of what was going on here.
Well,
Um,
here's the origin of this. All right,
of
I'm
the
going to
insulin
contribute
stuff.
something. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So, in 1927, Dr. Sackel, who had
Oh yeah.
recently qualified as a medical doctor in Vienna, so we got a noob, and was
Great.
working in a psychiatric clinic in Berlin, began to use low subcoma doses of insulin to treat drug addicts and psychopaths.
Hmm.
And when one of the patients experienced improved mental clarity after having slipped into an accidental coma, Sackel reasoned the treatment might work for mentally ill patients.
Ah.
Having returned to Vienna, he treated schizophrenic patients with larger doses of insulin in order to deliberately produce coma and sometimes convulsions. Sackel made his results public in 1933, and his methods were soon taken up by other psychiatrists.
Hmm.
And then it was introduced into the US in 1935. And then by the late 1940s, the majority of psychiatric hospitals in the US were using insulin coma treatment.
Yeah.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, we could go on, but
Yeah.
my goodness,
Yeah.
it just doesn't seem like a very well, who knows? I'm
Yeah.
not a I'm not
Yeah.
a scientist,
Yeah.
obviously, but
Yeah.
goodness.
Now Sylvia was not given enough to go into a coma because again, she was declared sane, so they were giving her much lower doses. But it seems like the effect of this was basically, uh, she gained a bunch of weight that made it sort of fogged her mind. That's basically she was basically in a what we call now a sugar coma. She's just basically in a sugar coma after this. And did it help? I mean, I guess it helped her from being immediate again actively suicidal. So who
Right.
knows?
I
But
mean, in fairness, if somebody's
yeah,
actively suicidal, they're trying to kill themselves. It's like you're just going to shoot anything you can
yeah,
at it to try to
yeah,
just stop that.
right,
Just
right,
stop. Just
right.
we'll try to bring you back from the brink. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, exactly, exactly. And I think generally, at least at this period, Dr. Barnhouse was probably largely beneficial to Sylvia. One thing that's kind of interesting is what Sylvia managed to see in her in Dr. Barnhouse is a professional woman who had a family. So she's sort of seeing like a version of this balance that she was hoping she might be able to achieve. So I think just talking to a person like that on a regular basis was kind of helpful. Um, she kind of see she had a role model like right in front of her. What Sylvia didn't know at the time was that Dr. Barnhouse's personal life was an absolute mess. She'd cut her father out of her life for various reasons. She'd lost custody of two of her children. Her husband was a raging alcoholic, and she was in like an intense state of grief. Um, uh, I don't want to get into a point where I'm overly criticizing Dr. Barnhouse, but I think, as we'll see towards the end of her life, I think Dr. Barnhouse could have helped and didn't, and made some what we might call, mistakes. It's Monday morning quarterbacking. But one thing I think we see as a bit of a mistake kind of early on is that in their conversations about in Barnhouse's and Sylvia's conversations about what's going on with her, at one point, Dr. Barnhouse says to Sylvia, quote, "I give you permission to hate your mother." And, you know, I don't know Sylvia's mother, but did you read biographical material? Her mother seems flawed, but who isn't? Well-intentioned, maybe a little sort of neurotic and maybe controlling at times, and maybe a little bit of a stage mother, but over the course of Sylvia's life is very supportive of some very radical choices that Sylvia makes. And so I think saying you go ahead and hate her is kind of unfair, frankly. And not only was it unfair, I think it actually opened up Sylvia and like gave Sylvia permission more generally to hate. And here, this is something we see in some of Sylvia's writing. she's really, in my opinion, my humble opinion, she's really unfair in her writing to a lot of the people in her life. Um, Her mother is one of them, but other people as well, where you kind of get the sense of like, Sylvia, you realize that these are just people and we're all kind of all screwing up all the time, right? Like you can't hold everybody to this standard or you're gonna everything's gonna be combat if you hold everybody to the standard. It's not gonna work, right? Um yeah, I think she took I think I had a line in here. I think she sometimes didn't very well understand that other people had their own emotional realities. It was very much like you did this thing and it had an effect on me, and so now you're the enemy. I think that's kind of what she did without understanding that the effect that person might have had may have been accidental, may have been incidental, may have been completely unforeseeable. But she would hold it against them. Um, anyway, let's read a poem about her mother. So this is a poem that really hurt her mother's feelings. It was written later in the late 50s. I'm probably not going to read all of it, but because it's kind of a long one. But it's called "The Disquieting Muses," and this is inspired by a painting by what's that painter Chirocco? Well, anyway, it's inspired by a
Hmm.
painting that she saw called "The Disquieting
Shiroko.
Muses."
Okay.
Yeah, maybe
Yeah.
look that up and tell me who painted "The
How
Disquieting
do you
Muses."
spell the disquieting
Yeah,
muses? Yeah, I'll look it up and then you
yeah,
read the poem and then I'll
yeah.
yeah.
Quote, "Mother, mother, what ill-bred aunt or what disfigured and unsightly cousin did you so unwisely keep unasked to my christening that she sent these ladies in her stead with heads like darning eggs to nod and nod and nod at foot and head and at the left side of my crib? Mother who made to order stories of Mixie Blackshort, the heroic bear, mother whose witches always got baked into gingerbread. I wonder whether you saw them, whether you said words to rid me of those three ladies, nodding by night around my bed, mouthless, eyeless, with stitched bald head. In the hurricane, when father's 12 study windows bellied in like bubbles about to break, you fed my brother and me cookies and Ovaltine and helped the two of us to choir. Thor is angry, boom, boom, boom. Thor is angry, we don't care. But those ladies broke the panes. When on tiptoe, the schoolgirls danced, blinking flashlights like fireflies and singing the glowworm song. I could not lift a foot in the twinkle dressed, but heavy-footed stood aside in the shadow cast by my dismal-headed godmothers, and you cried and cried, and the shadows stretched, the light went out. Mother, you sent me to piano lessons and praised my arabesques and trills, although each teacher found my touch oddly wooden in spite of scales and the hours of practicing, my ear tone deaf and yes, unteachable. I learned elsewhere from muses unhired by you, dear mother. I woke one day to see you, mother. And it goes on like that. But it's like it it feels like the biggest criticism of her mom in here in a certain way is you sent me to piano lessons. It's a very interestingly written poem, and I really like some of the lines. Just aesthetically, it's great. But like, it seems like her biggest criticisms of her mother is just like, you sent me to piano school, and I was tone deaf, and it didn't work. So I ended up learning stuff from other people than you. It's like,
Mhm.
like okay, like is that really? It's like I don't know. I just feel like sometimes Sylvia gets caught up in these like almost imagined transgressions against her, and
Mhm.
it makes them seem much more significant than they actually are.
Well, she's hyper intelligent and she's
Mm,
cutting against the grain of her own time, and she was reading
right,
Nietzsche. The
right.
the painter is Shiriko. I
Yeah,
don't know if
okay.
I'm pronouncing it
Yeah, I don't
correctly,
know.
but yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah.
she had a series of poems she wrote about paintings of his. So that
Yeah,
was
yeah.
one
It
of them.
sort of looks like a surrealist at
Yeah,
first glance. Yeah, yeah.
yeah. Okay, a couple more things about this time in McLean, and then we'll kind of move, and we'll keep moving on here.